Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Turning 27 felt like some kind of checkpoint I was not ready for. And my co-workers at the dental office where I worked as a hygienist threw me a small party in the break room that March of 2024. I had been single for almost 2 years at that point, not really looking but not opposed to meeting someone either. My life in Raleigh, North Carolina revolved around work, my 2 cats, and the occasional weekend trip to visit my mom a couple hours away. I lived in a ground floor apartment in a quiet complex near a strip mall, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but rarely spoke. One of the other hygienists, a woman named Faye who had become something like a best friend over the years, convinced me to download a dating app during our lunch break. She sat there watching me swipe through profiles, laughing at the bad ones, pointing out the ones she thought had potential. That afternoon I matched with a guy named Trevor Ashby, and Faye practically cheered when she saw his photos. He had kind eyes, a decent smile, and his bio mentioned he loved cooking and rescue dogs. We went on 4 dates over the next 3 weeks, and he was pleasant enough. Coffee near a bookstore, a walk through a park downtown, dinner at an Italian place he picked, and one night at his apartment where he cooked me pasta and we talked for hours. Trevor worked as some kind of database administrator, lived alone in a rented house about 20 minutes from my complex, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. He remembered that I preferred iced coffee even when it was cold outside, that my older cat was named Benson, that I had a complicated relationship with my father. But something about him made me uneasy in a way I could not quite name. He texted constantly, sometimes sending 4 or 5 messages before I could respond to the first one. He asked detailed questions about my schedule, my routine, where I shopped for groceries. After that 4th date, I knew I needed to end things before they went any further. I sent him a text on a Sunday afternoon, thanking him for the time we spent together but explaining I did not feel a romantic connection. His reply came almost instantly, just a single word: okay. No argument, no pushback, nothing. I thought I had handled it well. I thought he understood. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 weeks later. I was grabbing lunch at a sandwich shop I went to almost every Friday, a little place in a plaza near my office, when I spotted Trevor sitting at a corner table. He was just staring at me, not eating, not looking at his phone, just watching. When our eyes met, he smiled and gave me a small wave like we were old friends running into each other by coincidence. I waved back awkwardly, grabbed my order, and left as fast as I could without making it obvious I was rushing. I told myself it was nothing, that Raleigh was not that big and people crossed paths sometimes. But then it happened again 3 days later at the grocery store I always went to on Monday evenings. He was standing at the end of an aisle, pretending to look at cereal boxes, but I could feel his eyes following me as I moved through the store. I abandoned my cart and drove home with my heart pounding in my chest. That night I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows before I could even think about sleeping. Faye was the first person I told, and she took it seriously right away. She asked if I had kept any of his messages, if I knew his full address, if I had told anyone else. I showed her my phone, and that is when I realized he had been texting me again. Not anything threatening, just casual messages asking how I was doing, if I had tried that new coffee place downtown, if Benson was feeling better after his vet appointment. The thing is, I had never told him Benson was sick. I had posted about it on my private Instagram account the week before, the one I thought was locked down to only close friends. Faye scrolled through my followers list and found him there. A profile with no photo, and a generic username that I must have accepted without thinking months ago. He had been watching everything I posted, every story, every photo, every location tag. Faye grabbed my hand and looked me dead in the eyes and told me this was not normal, that this was stalking, and that I needed to document everything starting now. I wanted to believe she was overreacting, but somewhere deep in my gut I knew she was right. I blocked him on everything that same night. Instagram, the dating app, his phone number, even his email address that I found buried in an old message thread. For a few days, things went quiet, and I started to let myself breathe again. Then the messages started coming from new numbers, different area codes, always the same tone. He would ask why I was ignoring him, say he just wanted to talk, insist that we had something special and I was throwing it away. One message said he drove by my apartment and noticed I had left my living room light on all night, asked if I was having trouble sleeping. That one made me sick to my stomach. I started parking in different spots, taking alternate routes to work, checking my rearview mirror constantly. My mom could tell something was wrong when I called her that weekend, and when I finally explained the situation, her voice went sharp with fear. She wanted me to come stay with her, to call the police, to do something. But I kept thinking about all the stories I had heard where women reported stalkers, and nothing happened until it was too late. I went to the police station on a Saturday morning, bringing printed screenshots of every message, every sighting, every piece of evidence I had collected. The officer who took my report was a heavy-set man in his 50s who listened with a tired expression that told me he had heard versions of this story 100 times before. He explained that unless Trevor made an explicit threat or physically harmed me, there was not much they could do. He suggested I vary my routine, stay aware of my surroundings, maybe look into a restraining order if things escalated. I asked him what counted as escalation, and he just shrugged and said I would know it when I saw it. Walking out of that station, I felt more alone than I had in years. The system that was supposed to protect me had essentially told me to wait until something terrible happened before they could help. I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried until I could not breathe. Then I wiped my face and drove to Faye's house because I could not stand the thought of being alone in my apartment. Faye lived in a small ranch-style house in a neighborhood about 15 minutes from the dental office. She had bought the place 2 years earlier, after her divorce, and it had become a second home to me during all those late nights when we would drink wine and complain about difficult patients. That Saturday afternoon, she met me at the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. I told her everything about the police visit, about the officer's shrug, about feeling like I was screaming into a void. She made me tea and sat across from me at her kitchen table, and together we came up with a plan. I would stay with her for a while, just until things calmed down. I would keep documenting everything. We would look into hiring a lawyer, maybe pursue a civil restraining order since the criminal route seemed useless. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my own life again. Faye's house felt safe, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. I went back to my apartment that Sunday to pack a bag and grab some things for the cats. The plan was to bring Benson and my younger cat Noodle to stay at Faye's until I figured out my next move. When I pulled into my parking spot, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My chest tightened as I reached for it, already knowing who it was from. The handwriting was neat, almost careful, and the message was short. It said he knew I was scared, but that I did not need to be, that he would never hurt me, that we were meant to be together and eventually I would see that. He signed it with a small heart next to his name. I looked around the parking lot, scanning every car, every shadow, every window in the building surrounding mine. He could have been anywhere. He could have been watching me read his words at that very moment. I grabbed the note with shaking fingers, shoved it in my pocket, and practically ran to my apartment. I packed everything in under 20 minutes, stuffed both cats into their carriers despite their protests, and drove to Faye's house without stopping once. 3 days passed at Faye's place without incident, and I started to wonder if maybe the distance had finally made him lose interest. I kept going to work, kept documenting every unknown number that called, kept my head on a swivel whenever I walked to my car. Faye had installed a doorbell camera the year before, and we checked the footage religiously every evening, but it only ever showed delivery drivers and the occasional stray cat wandering through her yard. On the fourth night, a Wednesday, Faye had to work a late shift covering for another hygienist who called in sick. She told me to lock up tight, keep my phone charged, and call her if anything seemed strange. I made myself dinner, watched some mindless reality show on her couch, and tried to convince myself that this whole nightmare was finally winding down. Around 9 that evening, I took Benson and Noodle into the guest bedroom and settled in for an early night. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how grateful I was to have a friend like Faye, who would open her home to me without hesitation. I woke up sometime after 11 to the sound of knocking. Not loud or aggressive, just 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. There were no missed calls, no messages from Faye saying she was coming home early. I pulled up the doorbell camera app with trembling fingers and felt my entire body go cold when I saw who was standing on the porch. Trevor was looking directly into the camera, his face illuminated by the porch light, wearing that same calm smile he had given me at the sandwich shop weeks ago. He knocked again, 3 more slow taps, then leaned close to the camera and said my name. He said he knew I was inside, that he had followed me from my apartment days ago, that he just wanted to talk. His voice was soft, almost gentle, like he was coaxing a frightened animal out of hiding. I watched him through the screen as he tilted his head and asked why I was making this so difficult, why I could not just give us a real chance. I texted Faye with fingers that could barely hit the right keys, telling her he was here, begging her to call the police. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Trevor stood on the porch, occasionally glancing around the yard, checking his phone, acting like he had all the time in the world. I had moved into the hallway, crouched between the bathroom and the guest bedroom, trying to make myself as small as possible while keeping my eyes locked on the camera feed. Then I heard him walk off the porch, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led around the side of the house. I switched to the backyard camera and watched him approach the sliding glass door that opened into Faye's kitchen. He tested the handle, found it locked, and stood there for a moment with his hands pressed flat against the glass. The way he stared into the dark house made my skin prickle with a fear I had never felt before in my life. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, and I realized with horror that it was a small crowbar. The sound of metal against the door frame was loud enough to echo through the whole house. I called 911 with shaking hands, whispering my location and the situation to the dispatcher, who told me to stay hidden and that officers were on their way. I heard the glass shatter, heard his footsteps on the kitchen tile, heard him call my name again like we were playing some twisted game of hide and seek. I locked myself in the bathroom at the end of the hall, pressing my back against the door, clutching a pair of scissors I had grabbed from Faye's desk. His footsteps moved through the house slowly, methodically, opening doors and closing them one by one. He kept talking the whole time, his voice eerily calm, saying things like he forgave me for running, that he understood I was confused, that once we talked everything would make sense. When he reached the bathroom door, he knocked softly, the same 3 slow taps from before. He said my name and asked me to open up, promised he would not hurt me, said he just needed to see my face. I told him through the door that the police were coming, that he needed to leave now if he knew what was good for him. He laughed, a quiet sound that carried no humor at all, and said he did not care about the police, that they could not keep us apart. I heard him grip the doorknob, felt the door shudder as he put his weight against it. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I was screaming at that point, screaming for help, screaming for anyone to hear me. And then, like some kind of miracle, I heard sirens in the distance growing louder and louder. Trevor went silent. His footsteps retreated quickly down the hall, and I heard the back door slam. I stayed pressed against that bathroom door, scissors raised, until I heard officers announcing themselves inside the house. They caught Trevor 2 blocks away, running through someone's backyard with the crowbar still in his hand. He was arrested that night and charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. Faye arrived at her house 20 minutes after the police, and she held me on her front lawn while I sobbed into her shoulder. The restraining order I filed the next day was granted immediately. and Trevor's bail was set high enough that he sat in county jail for 3 months awaiting trial. He eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received 18 months in prison plus mandatory psychological evaluation. I moved out of my apartment and into a new place across town, somewhere he had never seen, somewhere I could start over. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media, and spent months in therapy trying to untangle the fear that had wound itself around every part of my daily life. Faye still checks in on me almost every day, and my mom drove down to stay with me for the first few weeks after everything happened. It has been almost 8 months now, and I still double-check my locks every night, still look twice at every car parked near my building, still feel a jolt of panic whenever someone knocks on my door unexpectedly. I know Trevor will be released eventually, and that thought sits in the back of my mind like a stone I cannot swallow. But I also know that I did everything right, that I trusted my instincts, that I leaned on the people who loved me when I needed them most. If you're reading this and something similar is happening to you, please listen to me. Document everything. Tell everyone you trust, and never let anyone make you feel crazy for being afraid. Your fear is valid, your safety matters, and you deserve to be believed. Heather and I had been sharing an apartment in Tucson for almost 3 years when it happened. She was a medical transcriptionist who worked from home, spending long hours alone in our converted second bedroom with her headphones on, typing reports while I sat in a gray cubicle across town crunching numbers at an accounting firm. We had met at a friend's barbecue the summer after I graduated college in 2015, and something just clicked between us. She had this quiet intensity about her, a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. I used to find that attractive. Now I understand it differently. Now I see how little I actually knew about what went on inside her head during all those silent hours, how the isolation of her job had been doing something to her, that I was too busy, too comfortable, too stupid to notice. October of 2022 started like any other month. Work was picking up as we headed toward the end of the fiscal year, and I found myself staying late more often than usual. One of the senior partners announced his retirement, and on that particular night, the whole office gathered at a bar downtown to celebrate. I texted Heather around 7 to say I would be home late. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji, nothing more. At the time, I appreciated how low maintenance she was, how she never guilt-tripped me or demanded constant updates on my whereabouts. That felt like trust. That felt like a healthy relationship. By the time I stumbled into an Uber around midnight, my head was fuzzy with beer, and my thoughts had already drifted to lazy weekend plans. Brunch at that new place she wanted to try. Maybe finally starting the puzzle her mom gave us last Christmas. Normal things. Safe things. I had no idea what was waiting for me in our dark apartment. When the driver pulled up to our building, I noticed that every window in our unit was completely dark. That was unusual because Heather always left the kitchen light on when she knew I would be coming home late. She said she liked the idea of me walking into something warm and welcoming rather than a pitch-black apartment. I figured she had just forgotten, or maybe fallen asleep early. The building was quiet as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the kind of thick silence that only exists after midnight in residential neighborhoods. Our door was locked, which was normal, and I let myself in as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake her. The living room was empty, the television off, and I could see a thin strip of pale moonlight cutting across the hallway floor from our bedroom. I slipped off my shoes by the door and padded toward the bedroom, already loosening my tie. I pushed open the bedroom door, expecting to find Heather asleep, maybe curled up on her side the way she usually slept. Instead, she was sitting upright in bed, perfectly still, facing the doorway. The moonlight coming through the blinds fell across her in broken stripes, and I could see her eyes were wide open, fixed directly on me. She did not say hello. She did not move. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something flatter, emptier, like she was looking at a stranger who had wandered into the wrong apartment. My first instinct was to ask if she was okay, if she had a nightmare, or could not sleep. But something about the way she held herself, that rigid stillness, made the words catch in my throat. The room felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the apartment. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice soft, the way you might talk to a scared animal. She did not answer right away. For maybe 5 or 6 seconds, she just continued staring at me, and I became acutely aware of how loud my own breathing sounded in that silence. Then she spoke, and her voice came out flat and measured, almost robotic. She asked me who I had been with tonight. I told her about the retirement party, the same thing I had texted her earlier, but she shook her head slowly like I was lying. She said she knew I was with someone else, that she had been thinking about it all night, running through the evidence in her head. I tried to laugh it off, told her she was being ridiculous, that she could check my phone if she wanted. But she did not reach for my phone. She just kept staring with those hollow eyes, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a normal bout of jealousy. Something had broken inside her while I was gone. I decided the best thing to do was to get into bed and let her calm down. Maybe she would feel better in the morning after some sleep, and we could talk about whatever was bothering her like rational adults. I walked around to my side of the bed, pulled back the covers, and sat down on the edge of the mattress to take off my socks. That is when I noticed her right hand had moved from her lap to somewhere beneath her pillow. I asked her what she had under there, trying to keep my tone casual even though my heart had started hammering in my chest. She said it was nothing, but the way her fingers curled around something out of sight, the way her whole body seemed to tense like a coiled spring, told me it was definitely not nothing. I asked her again, firmer this time, and she pulled her hand out slowly. In her grip was a kitchen knife, the big one we used for chopping vegetables, the blade catching the moonlight in a way that made my entire body go rigid. I raised both hands in front of me, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say, what to do, how to get that knife away from her without making things worse. I called her name softly, told her she was scaring me, asked her to please put the knife down so we could talk. She tilted her head to one side like a curious bird, studying me with that same empty expression. Then she said something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. She said she had been watching me sleep for the past few weeks, standing over the bed in the dark, trying to decide what to do about me. She said she had seen the signs, the way I looked at my phone, the way I smiled at texts I thought she could not see. None of it was true, but in her mind she had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was the villain of her story. I started to inch backward off the bed, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact with her. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt for the door and get out of that apartment as fast as my legs could carry me. But I also knew that sudden movements might trigger something, might push her over whatever edge she was balanced on. She watched me move with those unblinking eyes, the knife still clutched in her fist, and I could see a vein pulsing in her neck. When my feet touched the floor on the far side of the bed, I told her I was going to get her some water, that maybe she was dehydrated or having some kind of episode. I took one step toward the door. That was when she lunged. She came across the bed faster than I would have thought possible, the knife slashing through the air in a wide arc aimed directly at my chest. I threw myself backward and felt the blade whistle past my face, missing my throat by what could not have been more than an inch. I crashed into the dresser behind me, knocking over a lamp and a framed photo of us from happier times. The glass shattered against the floor, and for a split second I thought about grabbing a shard to defend myself, but there was no time. Heather was already coming at me again, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette being controlled by someone who did not quite know how the strings worked. I managed to grab her wrist as she swung the knife down toward my shoulder, and we struggled there in the darkness, her breath hot against my face, her eyes wild with something I can only describe as complete disconnection from reality. She was stronger than I expected, fueled by whatever storm was raging inside her head, and I could feel my grip slipping as she twisted and thrashed. I screamed her name over and over, begging her to stop, to come back to me, but it was like talking to a wall. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by something I did not recognize. I finally managed to twist her arm at an angle that forced her to drop the knife. It clattered to the floor somewhere in the darkness, and I kicked it away as hard as I could, hearing it skid across the hardwood and disappear under the bed. But even without the weapon, she did not stop. She clawed at my face, my arms, my chest, her fingernails raking deep grooves into my skin. I had no choice but to wrap my arms around her and pin her against me, holding her as tight as I could, while she screamed and thrashed and called me names I had never heard her use before. She accused me of poisoning her, of putting cameras in the walls, of working with her co-workers to ruin her life. None of it made sense. All of it terrified me. I held her like that for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, until finally, her body went limp, and she started to sob against my chest like a child waking from a nightmare. I called 911 with one hand while keeping my other arm wrapped around her. The dispatcher asked me a series of questions I could barely process, my voice shaking as I tried to explain that my girlfriend had just tried to kill me, but that I thought she was having some kind of mental breakdown. They sent police and paramedics, and I sat there on the bedroom floor with Heather crying in my arms, blood trickling down my face from where her nails had torn my skin, waiting for help to arrive. She kept mumbling apologies between sobs, saying she did not know what happened, that she had been so scared, that she thought I was going to hurt her first. I wanted to be angry. Part of me was angry, furious even, at how close I had come to dying in my own bedroom at the hands of someone I trusted completely. But mostly, I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only a shell sitting there on that cold floor. The paramedics took Heather to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, and I spent the next several hours at the police station giving my statement. The officers were surprisingly kind, one of them a woman named Tara, who brought me coffee and told me her brother had gone through something similar with his wife years ago. When I finally got back to the apartment the next morning, the sun was already up, and everything looked so painfully normal in the daylight. The broken lamp, the scattered glass, the scratch marks on my arms, those were the only evidence that anything had happened at all. I found the knife under the bed where I had kicked it, and I just stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile that ordinary kitchen utensil with the weapon that had nearly ended my life. I also found something else that day, something that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. In the back of her closet, hidden inside an old shoebox, were dozens of handwritten notes filled with paranoid ramblings about me, about her co-workers, about neighbors she believed were spying on her. Some of them dated back over 6 months. Heather was diagnosed with a severe psychotic disorder that had apparently been developing for much longer than either of us realized. The doctors told me that her isolation, working alone from home day after day with minimal human contact, had likely accelerated whatever was already brewing in her brain chemistry. She had been hiding her symptoms, masking them behind that quiet intensity I once found so attractive, convincing herself that her paranoid thoughts were valid concerns rather than warning signs of something deeply wrong. I visited her once at the psychiatric facility, where they transferred her after the initial evaluation. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before, and she cried when she saw the healing scratches on my face. She told me she remembered everything but that it had felt like watching herself from outside her own body, powerless to stop what was happening. I believed her. I also knew that I could never sleep next to her again, never close my eyes in her presence without seeing that knife glinting in the moonlight. It has been almost 2 years since that night, and I still sleep with my bedroom door locked. I moved to a different city, started over at a new firm, and eventually began seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma from domestic violence. That label felt strange at first, domestic violence, because I had always pictured something different when I heard those words. But my therapist helped me understand that what happened to me counts, that the scars on my arms and the ones inside my head are real and valid regardless of the circumstances that caused them. Heather is still receiving treatment, and her mother sends me updates occasionally that I am never quite sure how to respond to. Sometimes I think about the version of our life that existed before that October night, the weekend brunches, and unfinished puzzles and lazy Sunday mornings. And it feels like remembering a movie I watched a long time ago, rather than something I actually lived. The hardest part is not the fear, though that still surfaces sometimes when I wake up in the dark and have to remind myself where I am. The hardest part is knowing that the danger was there all along, sleeping right beside me, and I never saw it until the blade was already swinging toward my throat. Still trying to put all of this into words because I spent so long convincing myself it was normal. I met Wesley at a coworker's birthday party in the spring of 2022, and he seemed like everything I had been looking for after years of terrible dates and even worse relationships. Charming, attentive, the kind of guy who remembered small details about conversations we had weeks before. My friends from nursing school kept saying I deserved someone like him. We moved in together after 8 months, and for a while, everything was perfect. He cooked dinner most nights, surprised me with flowers on random Tuesdays, called me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice. I remember telling my mom on the phone that I finally understood what people meant when they said they found their person. She was so happy for me, and I was so certain I had figured out my life. My coworkers at the pediatric clinic where I worked used to tease me about how often I smiled at my phone when he texted. 26 years old, and convinced this was it, the real thing, the kind of love that actually lasts. The first time I saw Wesley drunk was at his company's holiday party that December. He had always been a social drinker around me, a beer or two with dinner, maybe a glass of wine on weekends, nothing that ever raised any concern. But that night he kept going back to the open bar, shot after shot, laughing too loud with his coworkers while I stood there not knowing anyone. By the time we left, he was someone I did not recognize. In the Uber home, he accused me of flirting with his boss, said I had embarrassed him in front of everyone by laughing at some joke the guy made. I tried to explain that I was just being polite, making small talk like anyone would at a work event, but he kept cutting me off, his voice getting louder each time. The driver kept glancing at us through the rearview mirror, and I wanted to disappear into the seat. When we got home, Wesley slammed the front door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall, then went straight to bed without another word. The next morning, he apologized with tears in his eyes, said the stress at work had been overwhelming, and he had drunk way more than he should have. He promised it would never happen again, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. For a few months after that, things went back to normal. Wesley cut back on drinking, at least around me, and I let myself forget how scared I had been in that Uber. We adopted a cat together, started talking about maybe getting engaged by the end of the year. I convinced myself that the holiday party was just a one-time thing, a bad night, the kind of story couples laugh about years later. But then his friend Todd had a bachelor party in March, and Wesley came home at 3 a.m. reeking of whiskey and stumbling into furniture. I was half asleep when I heard the front door open, and before I could even sit up, he was standing in the bedroom doorway asking why I had not answered his texts. I checked my phone, and there were 17 messages, each one angrier than the last, accusing me of ignoring him on purpose. I had been asleep. My phone was on silent because I had an early shift the next morning, but trying to explain that only made him angrier. He called me selfish, said I did not care about him, that any other girlfriend would have stayed up waiting. That became the pattern. Sober Wesley was sweet and considerate, the man I had fallen in love with. But when he drank, something shifted behind his eyes, and I never knew which version of him was coming home. Some nights he would just get quiet and pass out on the couch, and I would cover him with a blanket and feel relieved. Other nights he would pick fights over nothing, over dishes I had left in the sink, or a text from a male coworker he had seen on my phone. The accusations always came back to the same thing, that I was cheating, that I was looking at other men, that I did not love him enough. I started being careful about everything, I stopped mentioning male co-workers by name. I made sure the apartment was spotless before he got home on weekends when I knew he had been out with friends. I kept my phone face down on the table so he would not see notifications and get suspicious. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking my entire life to avoid setting him off. The isolation happened so gradually, I barely noticed it. First, it was my friend Kira, who Wesley said was a bad influence because she was single and liked going to bars. Then it was my co-worker June, who he claimed looked at him weird at a work event I had brought him to. One by one, he found reasons why the people in my life were problems. He never told me I could not see them, not directly. He just made it so exhausting that it was easier to stop trying. If I went out with friends, I would come home to hours of silent treatment or interrogation about where I had really been. If I talked on the phone with my mom for too long, he would sulk and say I cared more about her than about him. By the summer of 2023, my world had narrowed down to work and Wesley. I told myself it was just a phase, that once things calmed down at his job, he would go back to being the man I had fallen for. I kept waiting for that version of him to come back permanently. Then I lost my job. Budget cuts at the clinic meant they had to let go of 3 nurses, and I was one of them because I had the least seniority. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot after cleaning out my locker, crying and dreading having to tell Wesley. When I got home, he was surprisingly supportive at first. He said we would figure it out together, that I should take some time before jumping into another job, that he made enough to cover us both for a while. It felt like the old Wesley, the one who took care of me, and I let myself lean into that. But within a few weeks, the dynamic shifted in ways I had not expected. Suddenly every purchase I made was questioned. A coffee from the drive-thru, a new tube of mascara, groceries that he deemed too expensive. He started giving me a weekly allowance from our joint account, said it was just until I found something new, just to help us budget. I went from being an independent woman with my own income to asking permission to buy shampoo. And the worst part is that I felt guilty, like I owed him for supporting me, like I had no right to complain. The drinking got worse after that. Maybe it was the pressure of being the sole provider, or maybe he just stopped hiding it now that I was home all day with nowhere to go. He started keeping whiskey in the kitchen cabinet, bourbon on the nightstand. What used to be weekend drinking became every night drinking. I learned to gauge his mood by the sound of the bottle cap twisting open, by how many times I heard the clink of ice in his glass before dinner. 2 drinks meant he would be fine, maybe a little louder than usual, but manageable. 4 or more meant I needed to stay quiet, agree with everything, make myself small. I started cooking his favorite meals on nights when he seemed tense, thinking maybe if I just did everything right, he would not have a reason to get upset. I became an expert at reading the room, at noticing the slight tightening of his jaw, or the way he scrolled through his phone too aggressively. My whole existence revolved around preventing the next explosion. One night in October, he came home from a work happy hour already drunk. I could smell it on him the second he walked through the door, that sour mix of beer and something stronger. I was on the couch watching a cooking show, and he sat down next to me without saying anything. After a few minutes, he asked who I had been texting. I told him no one, because I had not touched my phone in hours. He grabbed it off the coffee table and started going through my messages, my photos, my email. I just sat there, too tired to argue, too scared to protest. When he did not find anything, he threw the phone back at me and said I must have deleted whatever I was hiding. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself another drink. I stayed on that couch for 2 more hours, not moving, barely breathing, just waiting for him to pass out so I could finally exhale. That was my life. Not constant violence, not bruises I had to explain. Just this endless waiting, this permanent state of dread that never fully went away even on the good days. I thought about leaving all the time. I would lie awake at night running through the logistics in my head, trying to figure out how I could make it work. But the math never added up. I had no savings because Wesley controlled our finances. I had no job because I had been too anxious to interview properly, too exhausted from walking on eggshells to put together a decent resume. My name was not on the lease. My car was in his name because he had co-signed when my credit was not good enough. The few friends I had left lived in other states, and my mom was in a one-bedroom apartment with no space for me. Every path out led to a dead end, and Wesley knew it. He never said it out loud, but I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes, this quiet confidence that I was not going anywhere. He would apologize after the bad nights, buy me flowers, promise to cut back on drinking, and I would stay because what else was I supposed to do? Sleep in my car, show up at my mother's door like a failure, start over with nothing at 27 years old. The night everything changed was a Saturday in November. Wesley had been drinking since noon because his college football team was playing some big rivalry game. By the time the game ended, he had finished most of a bottle of bourbon and was louder than I had ever seen him. I made the mistake of asking if he wanted me to order some food, thinking maybe getting something in his stomach would help. He snapped at me, said I was always nagging, always trying to control him. I apologized and went to the bedroom to get away from it, but he followed me. He stood in the doorway blocking my exit, going on about how I thought I was better than him, how I looked down on him for drinking, how I was probably planning to leave him the second I got a job. I kept saying I was not. I was not. I just wanted to order dinner. But he kept getting closer, backing me toward the wall, his voice getting louder until he was screaming inches from my face. I could feel the heat of his breath, could see the veins in his neck. He punched the wall right next to my head, and I felt the impact vibrate through my whole body. Something broke inside me in that moment. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the movies where the victim suddenly fights back. It was quieter than that. I just looked at the hole in the drywall, at the plastered dust on his knuckles, and I knew with absolute certainty that next time, it would be my face. Maybe not the next fight, maybe not even the one after that, but eventually. I could see the trajectory so clearly, like watching a car slide on ice toward a guardrail. He stormed out of the room after that, grabbed his keys, and left. I heard his truck peel out of the driveway, and I stood there staring at that hole in the wall for what felt like an hour. Then I called my mom. I had not really talked to her in months, had kept our conversation short and surface level because I did not want her to know how bad things had gotten. But that night I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she just said, "Come home." She would figure out the space. She would help me find a job. Just come home. I left the next morning while Wesley was still passed out. I took one suitcase, my cat, and my phone charger. I left behind 2 years of clothes, furniture we had picked out together, a life I had thought was going to be forever. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, and I kept checking the rearview mirror expecting to see his truck behind me. The drive to my mom's place took 4 hours, and I cried for most of it, not because I was sad, but because I was terrified and relieved and angry at myself for staying so long. It has been almost a year now. I have a new job at a hospital 2 towns over from my mom. I am saving money, slowly rebuilding the friendships I let wither, learning how to exist without constantly scanning for danger. Wesley tried to contact me for a few months after I left. Texts that cycled between apologetic and threatening, voicemails where he sobbed and begged and then called me names in the same breath. I changed my number eventually, blocked him on everything. Some days I still flinch when I hear ice clinking in a glass, still tense up when someone raises their voice unexpectedly. I do not know if that ever fully goes away, but I got out. That is the part I need people to understand. It took me way too long, and I lost so much of myself in the process, but I got out. And if anyone reading this sees their own life in these words, please know that the logistics that seem impossible, the obstacles that feel insurmountable, they can be figured out. There are people who will help you. You just have to reach out, even when every part of you is convinced that you cannot. February in Minneapolis has a way of making everything feel frozen in place. Not just the ice on the sidewalks, but time itself. Like the whole world is holding its breath waiting for spring. I remember that feeling perfectly the week my life started crumbling. Walking home from the clinic where I worked as a physical therapist, my boots crunching through gray slush while my phone buzzed with messages I was too exhausted to check. My graduating class from the University of Minnesota had their 10-year reunion coming up that May, which gives you an idea of where I was in life. Finally established in my career, proud of the small house I had scraped together enough savings to buy in a quiet neighborhood near Powderhorn Park. Cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. I had been with Julian for almost 3 years by then. Met him at a friend's barbecue, fell hard and fast, moved in together after 8 months. He was charming in that effortless way that made everyone gravitate toward him at parties. He remembered birthdays, asked about your sick aunt, brought wine to dinner gatherings. My friends loved him. My mom called him the one. I believed it too, right up until the moment I found the messages on his phone from not one, not two, but 4 different women. When I confronted him, he cried. When I told him to leave, he begged. When I changed the locks, he went silent. That silence should have been a relief. Instead, it was the calm before something I never could have anticipated. The first sign came 3 days after I asked him to move out. My coworker Janine, someone I had known for 6 years and considered one of my closest friends, stopped responding to my texts. At first I figured she was busy. Her daughter had just started kindergarten. Her husband was traveling for work. But when I saw her in the break room that Friday, she looked at me with this expression I had never seen before. It was cold, almost pitying, like I was someone she had just heard terrible things about. She made small talk for maybe 30 seconds before excusing herself, and I stood there holding my coffee mug, completely confused. That weekend, my friend Troy from college texted me something strange. "Hey, Julian reached out. I didn't know things got that bad between you two. Hope you're getting the help you need." I read that message probably 15 times trying to decode it. What help? What had Julian told him? I called Troy immediately, but he let it go to voicemail. When he finally called back 2 days later, his voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they think they are talking to someone unstable. Troy told me that Julian had called him crying, saying he was worried about me, saying that I had been struggling with some issues, and that the breakup had pushed me over the edge. According to Julian, I had been having paranoid episodes, accusing him of things he never did, making up affairs that existed only in my imagination. He told Troy that he still loved me and wanted me to get better, that he was only reaching out because he cared about my well-being. Troy asked me gently, carefully, like he was talking to a child holding a knife, if I had considered seeing a therapist. I sat there on my couch with the phone pressed to my ear, my whole body going numb as I realized what was happening. Julian was not just moving on. He was rewriting our entire relationship, and he was using everyone I cared about to do it. I tried to explain the truth, the messages I found, the women, the lies, but I could hear the doubt in Troy's silence. Julian had gotten to him first, and now everything I said just sounded like the ravings of a woman who could not accept reality. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself with sickening precision. My cousin Elise, who I had been close with since childhood, called to say she was there for me, in a way that made it clear she thought I was falling apart. My neighbor Wanda, an older woman who had always waved at me from her garden, started avoiding eye contact when I walked past. My supervisor at the clinic, a no-nonsense woman named Francine who I had always respected, pulled me into her office to ask if everything was okay at home, because someone had reached out with concerns. I asked who. She said she was not at liberty to say, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Julian was methodical. He was patient. He picked the people who mattered most to me, the ones whose opinions I valued, whose support I relied on, and he poisoned each of them one by one. And the worst part was that he did it while wearing the mask of a concerned ex-boyfriend who just wanted me to be okay. He made himself look like the victim by pretending to be worried about the real victim. He was so good at it that sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I was the crazy one. Maybe I had imagined everything. I started keeping a folder on my phone with screenshots of everything. The original messages I found on his phone before he could delete them, the texts from friends asking if I was okay, timestamps and dates for every strange interaction. I needed proof, not just for other people but for myself, because the constant gaslighting was starting to make me question my own memories. That folder became my lifeline, a reminder that I was not losing my mind, that the things I remembered had actually happened. But Julian was escalating. 3 weeks after the breakup, I came home from work to find a bouquet of white lilies on my doorstep. My favorite flowers, the ones he used to buy me on our anniversary. There was no card, no note, nothing to indicate who had left them. When I texted him asking if they were from him, he replied with a single question mark, like he had no idea what I was talking about. The next morning, I found another bouquet in the exact same spot. This time I checked my doorbell camera, but the footage showed nothing. Just an empty porch one frame and flowers the next, as if they had materialized out of thin air. I went through the settings and realized someone had deleted the footage remotely. Julian still had the password from when we set up the system together, and I had never thought to change it. That realization sent me spiraling into a kind of fear I had never experienced before. If he could access my doorbell camera, what else could he see? I spent that entire Saturday changing every password I could think of: email, bank accounts, streaming services, the smart thermostat, even the Wi-Fi router. My fingers were trembling so badly that I kept making typos and having to start over. I called my phone provider and asked them to check if there were any unknown devices linked to my account. There were two. One was an old tablet I'd forgotten about. The other was a phone I had never seen before, added to my account 3 months ago while Julian and I were still together. The representative's voice was calm and professional as she helped me remove it, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. He had been tracking me. For months, maybe longer, he had been watching where I went, reading my messages, listening to my calls. Every private conversation I thought I was having in confidence, with my mom, with my friends, with my therapist. He had access to all of it. That was how he knew exactly who to contact, exactly what to say, exactly which buttons to push to make people doubt me. I had been living inside his surveillance the whole time, like an insect trapped under glass, thinking I was free while he watched my every move. I went to the police the next morning, a Sunday, sitting in that fluorescent-lit waiting room for almost 2 hours before an officer finally called my name. His name tag said Officer Hendricks, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who looked like he had heard 1,000 stories just like mine. I showed him everything: the screenshots, the deleted camera footage, the unauthorized device on my phone account, the messages from friends proving Julian was contacting them behind my back. He listened, nodded, took notes in a little spiral pad, and then told me there was not much they could do. Julian had not made any direct threats. The flowers could have been from anyone. Accessing a shared account was not technically illegal if he had been given the password at some point. Hendricks suggested I get a restraining order if I felt unsafe, but warned me that without evidence of physical threat or harassment, it probably would not be granted. I walked out of that station feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The system was not designed to protect people like me from people like Julian. It was designed to wait until something terrible happened, and then maybe, if I was lucky, do something about it afterward. The confrontation happened 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening that started out almost peaceful. I had just gotten home from work and was heating up leftover soup when my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. I had changed all the passwords, installed new software, done everything I could to lock Julian out, and saw him standing on my porch. He was wearing the blue sweater I had bought him for his birthday, the one he knew I loved, and he was holding a single white lily in his hand. My whole body went rigid. I did not answer the door. I watched him through the camera as he stood there for 1 minute, then 2, then 5, his expression shifting from patient to annoyed to something darker, something I had only glimpsed a few times during our relationship. He leaned close to the camera, close enough that I could see the pores on his nose, and said in a voice so calm it made my skin prickle, I know you're watching, sweetheart. I know you're always watching. But you should know that I'm watching too. And I'm much better at this game than you are." Then he smiled, placed the lily gently on the doormat, and walked away into the darkness. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the house turned on, a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, watching the doorbell camera feed on my phone until my eyes burned. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I started taking different routes to work, leaving at odd hours, parking in different spots every day. I told Francine I was dealing with a personal situation and asked to adjust my schedule so I would never be alone at the clinic during opening or closing. She agreed, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Not concern for my safety, but concern about my mental state, which meant Julian's story had already taken root. I stopped answering calls from numbers I did not recognize. I stopped checking my mailbox for days at a time because I was afraid of what I might find there. My mother called me one evening, and the first thing she said was, "Honey, Julian came by the house today. He's really worried about you." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. He had driven 3 hours to my mother's house in St. Cloud, sat in her living room, drank her coffee, and told her God knows what about me. When I tried to explain the truth, my own mother, the woman who raised me, who knew me better than anyone, hesitated before saying, "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone, a professional. Julian said you've been having episodes and I just want to make sure you're okay." I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I had ever done that, and I immediately felt sick with guilt, but I could not listen to another word. That Friday, I came home to find my back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I had started checking every lock 3 times before leaving, a new ritual born from fear. But when I turned the handle, it swung open without resistance. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. My laptop was still on the kitchen table where I had left it. My jewelry box was untouched. But something was different, something I could not identify at first. A wrongness in the air that made my lungs feel tight. Then I saw it. On my bedroom pillow, placed exactly in the center like a mint at a hotel, was a photograph. It was a picture of me sleeping, taken from inside my own bedroom, the angle suggesting the photographer had been standing right next to my bed. I was wearing the old college t-shirt I had slept in 2 nights ago. My mouth was slightly open. I looked peaceful, completely unaware that someone was standing over me in the dark, watching me close enough to touch me. On the back of the photo, written in Julian's handwriting, were 4 words. "You look so peaceful." I do not remember calling the police. I do not remember what I said to them. I only remember sitting on my front steps in the cold, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, waiting for the sirens while the photograph sat on the ground beside me like a dead thing I could not bear to touch again. This time, they had to take me seriously. The officers who responded that night were different from Officer Hendricks. A woman named Sergeant Adler took one look at the photograph, the handwriting on the back, and the doorbell footage from the week before, and her jaw tightened in a way that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. She asked me detailed questions about Julian, his full name, his address, his workplace, his vehicle, his habits. She took the photograph as evidence, dusted my back door for fingerprints, and had a locksmith come out that same night to change every lock in my house and install a deadbolt on my bedroom door. Before she left, she gave me her card and told me to call her directly if anything else happened, day or night. "Men like this," she said, standing on my porch with her hand resting on her belt, "they don't stop on their own. They stop when the consequences become real for them, or they don't stop at all. We're going to make sure the consequences become very real." The restraining order was filed the next morning, and this time it was granted. Julian was served at his workplace, in front of his colleagues, which I later learned was intentional on Sergeant Adler's part. She wanted to crack his perfect image, to let people see that the charming, concerned ex-boyfriend was actually under a court order to stay away from the woman he claimed to be worried about. For a while it worked. Julian kept his distance, at least physically. The flowers stopped appearing. My back door stayed locked. But the damage to my reputation had already been done, and I spent the following months trying to rebuild relationships that had been poisoned by his lies. Some people came around once they heard about the restraining order, once they realized that the situation was serious enough for the courts to get involved. Troy called to apologize, sounding genuinely shaken. My mother drove down from St. Cloud and sat with me for 3 days, crying and holding my hand and saying she was sorry she had not believed me. But others never came back. Janine transferred to a different clinic without ever speaking to me again. My cousin Elise sent me a long message saying she did not want to take sides and thought it was best if we took a break from our friendship. I learned something important during that time. You can tell people the truth, you can show them evidence, you can have the law on your side, and some of them will still choose to believe the version of reality that is easier for them to accept. Julian had planted seeds of doubt so deep that even proof could not dig them out. I still live in Minneapolis, still work at the same clinic, still walk the same streets I walked when I was with him. But I'm not the same person I was before. I check my locks obsessively. I keep pepper spray in my purse and a bat beside my bed. I look over my shoulder when I walk to my car at night. And sometimes when the light hits a stranger's face a certain way, my heart still pounds like it is trying to escape my chest. Julian moved out of state 8 months after the restraining order was filed. I know because Sergeant Adler calls me every few months to give me updates, a kindness I never expected from the system that had initially failed me. But even with him gone, even with an entire state between us, I cannot shake the feeling that he is still watching. That somewhere out there, he is waiting for the restraining order to expire, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for his next opportunity to remind me that he is much better at this game than I am. I hope I never find out if that feeling is right. Sometimes I still catch myself checking the locks twice before bed, even though Wes moved out over a year ago. Old habits, I guess. We were together for almost 2 years, living in a small apartment in Louisville, Kentucky, the kind of place with thin walls where you could hear your neighbors arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. I met him through mutual friends at a barbecue. Nothing special, just burgers and cheap beer in someone's backyard. He was funny, charming, had this way of listening to you like every word mattered. By the time my class of 2012 reunion rolled around, we were already sharing a lease and talking about getting a dog. My old classmates kept telling me how happy I looked, how lucky I was to find someone like him, and for a while I believed them. I work as a nurse at a local hospital, long shifts that leave you exhausted, and coming home to Wes felt like a relief back then. He would have dinner ready, ask about my day, make me laugh after 12 hours of dealing with difficult patients. That version of him feels like a stranger now. The first time he scared me was over something stupid. Dishes in the sink. He had left them piling up for 3 days, and I made a comment about it when I got home from work. Nothing mean, just tired, like, hey, can you take care of that tomorrow? He turned around so fast I stepped back without thinking. His whole face changed, jaw tight, eyes hard, and he slammed his fist into the kitchen counter. The laminate cracked right down the middle. That sound, that sharp crack, I can still hear it if I think about it too long. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Then he apologized, said work had been stressful, said it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him, so I did. That is what you do when you love someone. You tell yourself it was a one-time thing. You file it away in the back of your mind, and you move forward. But things like that, they do not stay filed away. They sit there, waiting. After that night, things were good for a few months. Wes started seeing a therapist, said he wanted to work on his anger issues, and I thought we had turned a corner. He bought me flowers, planned weekend trips, did all the things that made me fall for him in the first place. I convinced myself that the counter incident was an isolated event, a glitch in an otherwise healthy relationship. But then, there was the time he punched a hole in the bedroom wall because I forgot to text him when I got to work. And the time he threw his phone across the room so hard it shattered against the refrigerator because his boss criticized him during a meeting. Each time he apologized. Each time he promised to do better. And each time I noticed that the explosions were getting closer together, the triggers smaller. I started monitoring my own behavior, choosing my words carefully, tiptoeing around certain topics. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking myself to fit into the spaces his anger left behind. The day everything changed started like any other Saturday. We slept in, made breakfast together, watched some documentary about deep-sea creatures that Wes had been wanting to see. Around noon, he said he wanted to talk about something important. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and he asked me to sit down on the couch. I remember thinking he was going to propose, that all the therapy had worked and he was ready for the next step. Instead, he told me that his therapist had helped him identify something about himself. He said he had been having violent thoughts, intrusive ones, that came to him during moments when he felt overwhelmed or upset. He described them as flashes, images that appeared in his mind without warning. He said sometimes, when we argued, he would picture himself hurting me, choking me, hitting me. He said the images were so vivid that he could almost feel his hands doing it. I sat there on that couch, our breakfast dishes still in the sink. The TV paused on a shot of some bioluminescent fish, and I had no idea what to say. He kept talking, filling the silence I could not fill. He said his therapist told him these were intrusive thoughts, that lots of people have them, that they do not mean he would ever act on them. He said the fact that he was disturbed by these images was actually a good sign, proof that he was not a violent person at his core. He reached for my hand while he spoke and I let him take it, but my fingers felt numb, disconnected from the rest of my body. He said he wanted to be honest with me because he loved me, because he trusted me, because hiding this felt like a betrayal. I remember nodding, saying something like, "I appreciate you telling me," but my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. The whole time he was talking, I kept thinking about all those moments when his face would change during arguments, when his eyes would go dark and empty for just a second before he caught himself. I always thought he was just angry. Now I knew what he was seeing in those moments. He was seeing his hands around my throat. That night I could not sleep. Wes fell asleep easily, the way he always did, like confessing something that heavy had lifted a weight off his shoulders. I lay there next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, and I could not stop my mind from racing. Every time he shifted in his sleep, I flinched. Every time his arm brushed against mine, I tensed up. I kept replaying his words, trying to convince myself that he was right, that intrusive thoughts were normal, that having them did not make him dangerous. But then I thought about the cracked counter, the hole in the wall, the shattered phone. Those were not thoughts, those were actions. And the line between thinking about violence and committing violence suddenly seemed very thin, almost invisible. I got up around 4 in the morning, went to the kitchen, and just stood there in the dark looking at the crack in the laminate that we never got fixed. I traced it with my finger, feeling the rough edge where his fist had landed, and I wondered how many times he had pictured doing that to my face instead. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I tried to act normal, to pretend that his confession had not changed everything between us, but it had. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The way he would clench his jaw when I said something he did not like. The way his hands would ball into fists during small disagreements, even when his voice stayed calm. The way he would stare at me sometimes, just stare, with this blank expression that I used to think meant he was lost in thought. Now I wondered what thoughts he was lost in. I called my sister one afternoon while Wes was at work, and I tried to explain what he had told me without making it sound too alarming. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me a question that I could not answer. She asked if I felt safe. I told her yes because that was what I was supposed to say, but the word tasted like a lie in my mouth. The truth was, I did not know anymore. The truth was I had started hiding the kitchen knives in a different drawer, one he would not think to check. A month after his confession, we had an argument about money. Something small, a credit card bill that was higher than expected. Wes was already in a bad mood because of something that happened at his job, and my comment about the bill set him off. He did not hit me. He did not even raise his voice at first. But he backed me into a corner of the living room, literally, physically backed me into a corner with his body, and he stood there breathing hard, his face inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the vein pulsing in his neck. He did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. He just stood there, blocking my path, his fists clenched at his sides. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that he was seeing one of those images. He was seeing himself hurting me. I could tell by the way his eyes flickered, the way his whole body seemed to vibrate with something he was trying to hold back. Then he stepped away, walked to the bedroom, and closed the door. I stayed in that corner for 10 minutes, my back pressed against the wall, too scared to move. I started making a plan after that night. Nothing dramatic, just small things. I opened a separate bank account and started putting a little money in it every week. I made copies of my important documents and left them at my sister's place. I started keeping my car keys in my pocket, instead of on the hook by the door. Wes noticed something was different, I could tell, but he did not say anything directly. Instead, he became sweeter, more attentive, like he was trying to make up for something he had not technically done. He brought me flowers, cooked my favorite meals, told me he loved me more often than usual. Part of me wanted to believe that he was trying, that the therapy was working, that we could still make this work. But another part of me, the part that had stood in that corner watching his fists clench and unclench, knew better. I read articles online about intrusive thoughts, trying to understand what he was going through. The articles said these thoughts were common, that most people who have them never act on them, that they were more distressing to the person having them than to anyone else. But those articles were not written about people who had already punched holes in walls. They were not written about people who backed their partners into corners and stood there vibrating with barely contained rage. The day I finally left started like any other morning. We had coffee together, talked about nothing important, and he kissed me goodbye before heading to work. I waited until his car turned the corner at the end of our street. Then I moved faster than I had ever moved in my life. I had already packed a bag and hidden it in the trunk of my car 2 days earlier. I grabbed my laptop, the folder with my documents, and the small box where I kept jewelry my grandmother had left me. I took one last look at the apartment, at the cracked counter and the patched hole in the bedroom wall and the couch where he had told me about the images in his head. Then I walked out, and I did not look back. I drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, checking my rearview mirror the whole time, half expecting to see his car following me. He called me 17 times that afternoon. I did not answer. I sent him one text message that evening, telling him it was over, telling him not to contact me again. He responded with a wall of text, apologies and promises and accusations all mixed together, ending with a sentence that still keeps me up at night. He wrote that he had never been closer to acting on those thoughts than he was at that moment. I blocked his number after that message, blocked him on every social media platform I could think of, and told my sister not to tell anyone where I was staying. For weeks I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time a car drove slowly past the house, every time someone knocked on the door. My sister installed extra locks and bought a security camera for the front porch. I filed for a restraining order, which was granted after I showed the judge the text message he had sent me. The judge read it twice, looked at me over her glasses, and asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I told her I did. What I did not tell her was that I still woke up in the middle of the night sometimes, heart pounding, certain that I had heard his footsteps in the hallway. I did not tell her that I had started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, or that I flinched whenever a man raised his voice in public. Some things you do not say out loud because saying them makes them too real. You just carry them with you, like stones in your pockets, and you hope that someday they will feel lighter. It has been 14 months since I left. Wes tried to contact me a few times through mutual friends, but they all told him to leave me alone. Last I heard, he moved to another state, somewhere out west, and started dating someone new. I think about her sometimes, this woman I have never met. And I wonder if he told her what he told me. I wonder if she notices the way his eyes go empty during arguments, if she has started hiding things without knowing why, if she lies awake at night wondering about the line between a thought and an action. I hope she is safe. I hope he really is just someone with intrusive thoughts who would never act on them. But I also know what I felt in that corner, pressed against the wall, watching him fight against something inside himself. I know what I read in that final text message, and I know that I got out just in time. Some people might say I overreacted, that I should have given him more of a chance, that leaving someone over thoughts they cannot control is cruel. But those people have never felt what I felt. They have never had to choose between empathy and survival. I chose survival. And I would make the same choice again. My graduating class from nursing school had their 10-year reunion last spring, which puts into perspective how long I spent believing I had found the perfect relationship. I had been working as a dental hygienist at a family practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for about 2 years when I matched with Vincent on a dating app. He had this disarming smile in his photos and a bio that mentioned loving rescue dogs and hiking in the Sandias. Our first date lasted 5 hours. Dinner turned into drinks, turned into walking around Old Town until the shops closed. He listened like nobody had ever listened to me before, asking follow-up questions, remembering every detail. When he texted me the next morning with a reference to an obscure movie I had mentioned loving as a kid, I thought I had hit the jackpot. I told my sister Noelle that this one felt different. She warned me that charm could be a mask, but I laughed her off. 6 months into the relationship, Vincent had basically moved into my apartment. It happened gradually, a toothbrush here, a drawer there, until one day I realized most of his clothes were in my closet. I did not mind at first because everything still felt like a dream. He would have coffee ready when I woke up, knew my work schedule better than I did, and always seemed to anticipate what I needed before I asked. But then the small things started piling up in ways I could not ignore. He mentioned a conversation I had with my best friend Wendy over the phone, a private call I took in my car during lunch break. When I asked how he knew about it, he shrugged and said I must have told him. I knew I had not. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above our bed, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. The incidents kept accumulating like drops of water filling a bucket. One Wednesday, I decided on a whim to stop by a bookstore after work, a place I had never been to, chosen completely at random because I passed it on my way home, and the window display caught my eye. I spent maybe 40 minutes browsing, bought a paperback novel, and drove home. When I walked through the door, Vincent looked up from his laptop and asked if I found anything good at the bookstore. I had not told him I was going. I had not texted anyone about it. The decision had been entirely spontaneous, made in the span of 3 seconds while sitting at a red light. I asked him how he knew, and he gave me this look, patient, almost amused, and said my car had been parked there for a while, so he assumed. I did not ask how he knew where my car was parked. Some part of me was already too afraid of the answer. A week later, I tested him without meaning to. My coworker Jill invited me to her daughter's birthday party on Saturday afternoon, and I mentioned it to Vincent over dinner, telling him it started at 3. The party actually started at 2. I wanted to see if he would slip up, if he somehow knew the real time from somewhere other than me. Saturday came, and around 1:30, Vincent casually mentioned that I should probably start getting ready since the party started in half an hour. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I had told him 3 o'clock. I specifically remembered saying 3. He saw my face and quickly added that he must have misheard, that he thought I said 2. But the way his eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, told me he knew exactly what he had done. That night, after he fell asleep, I went through my phone with trembling fingers, checking every app, every setting, looking for something I could not name but knew had to be there. I found it buried 3 screens deep in my location settings, an app I did not recognize, disguised with a generic icon that looked like a system utility. When I searched the name online, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might pass out. It was tracking software, the kind marketed to parents who want to monitor their teenagers, but used by people like Vincent for something far more sinister. It logged my GPS location every 30 seconds. It recorded my text messages, my calls, my browsing history. It could even activate my microphone remotely. The app had been installed 8 months ago, which meant it had been on my phone since our second month of dating. Back when he would borrow my phone to look something up or take a photo of us together. I sat on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, reading article after article about stalkerware, about intimate partner surveillance, about women whose lives had been dismantled by someone who claimed to love them. I deleted the app immediately, then realized that might have been a mistake. Vincent acted completely normal the next morning. He made breakfast, kissed my forehead, asked about my plans for the day. I watched his face for any sign that he knew I had found the app, any flicker of awareness that his window into my life had been closed. Nothing. His calm terrified me more than anger would have. I called my sister during my lunch break, whispering in the supply closet at work, telling her everything I had discovered. Noelle did not hesitate. She told me I needed to leave, that this was not love but control, that men like Vincent did not stop at digital surveillance. She offered me her guest room in Denver, said I could stay as long as I needed. I told her I would think about it, but the truth was, I had already made up my mind. That evening, I waited until Vincent left for his weekly poker game with friends. Then I packed 2 suitcases with everything essential and loaded them into my car. I left my keys on the kitchen counter and drove west on I-40 without looking back. The first 2 weeks at Noelle's place felt like emerging from underwater. I got a new phone with a new number, created fresh email accounts, and changed every password I could think of. I blocked Vincent on everything, though I knew he probably had backup ways to find me. My sister lived in a quiet neighborhood with a security system and a German shepherd named Bowie, who barked at every shadow. I started sleeping through the night again. I applied for dental hygienist positions in the Denver area, and even went on 2 interviews that seemed promising. For a brief window, I let myself believe that leaving had been enough, that Vincent would move on to someone else, that my nightmare was over. Then, the flowers arrived. A bouquet of white lilies, my favorite, a detail I had mentioned once during our first month together, delivered to my sister's front door with a card that said only, "I understand you needed space. I can wait." There was no sender name, no return address, but the message was clear. He knew exactly where I was. I called the police that same afternoon, shaking as I explained the situation to an officer who looked barely old enough to drink. He took notes, nodded sympathetically, and told me there was not much they could do about flowers. No direct threat had been made, no law had been broken. He suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order, though he warned me those were difficult to obtain without evidence of physical danger. I wanted to scream at him that the danger was real, that Vincent had been inside my phone for months, that he had driven 6 hours to find my sister's address without me telling a single person where I was going. But I kept my voice steady and thanked him for his time. That night, Noelle and I went through her house inch by inch, checking for anything unusual. We found it in her living room, a small device the size of a button battery, stuck to the underside of the coffee table. Vincent had been inside the house. He had been close enough to plant a listening device while we slept, or while we were at work. Noelle called a locksmith at 11 at night, and neither of us closed our eyes until every lock in the house had been replaced. The next few days blurred into a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I started noticing things I had overlooked before. A car that seemed to idle too long at the end of the block, a man in a baseball cap walking past the house twice in 1 hour, the sensation of being watched even when I was alone in a room with the blinds drawn tight. Noelle took time off work to stay with me, and we developed a routine of checking every window latch, every door lock, every corner of every room before settling in for the night. I filed for a restraining order, gathering every piece of evidence I had: screenshots of the stalkerware app, photos of the listening device, the card that came with the flowers. The judge granted a temporary order, which meant Vincent was legally required to stay 500 feet away from me and have no contact whatsoever. When he was served with the papers, he did not contest them. He did not show up to the hearing. His silence felt like a predator waiting in tall grass, patient and certain that his moment would come. 3 weeks after the restraining order was issued, I received an email to my new address, the one I had created specifically to escape him, the one I had only used for job applications and communication with my sister. The subject line was empty. The body of the message contained a single photograph. Me, sitting in Noelle's kitchen that same morning, drinking coffee in my pajamas. The photo was taken through the window above the sink, shot from the backyard at an angle that suggested he had been crouched behind the fence. I could see the timestamp embedded in the image file, 7:42 in the morning, exactly when I remembered standing at that counter. I showed the photo to the police, to the detective now assigned to my case, to anyone who would listen. They increased patrols in the neighborhood. They took the restraining order violation seriously. But Vincent was a ghost. His apartment in Albuquerque had been vacated. His car was registered to an address that turned out to be an empty lot. His phone number was disconnected. On paper, he had ceased to exist, but I knew he was out there, circling closer, waiting for the moment my guard slipped. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Noelle's neighbor, a retired electrician named Howard, mentioned that he had seen a cable company van parked on the street several times over the past month, always in the early morning, always gone by the time anyone was fully awake. He thought it was strange because nobody on the block had scheduled any service calls. I passed the information to the detective, a woman named Arlene Kendall, who had started treating my case like a personal mission. She pulled traffic camera footage from the area and traced the van to a rental company in Colorado Springs. The credit card used for the rental belonged to a man named David Merritt, a name I had never heard. But when Detective Kendall showed me his driver's license photo, the air left my lungs in a single painful rush. It was Vincent. Different hair, glasses I had never seen him wear, but unmistakably him. He had created an entirely new identity to continue watching me. The police issued a warrant that same day, and within 48 hours they found him in a motel room 12 miles from my sister's house, surrounded by printed photographs of me, detailed logs of my daily movements, and equipment I could not even identify. Vincent was arrested and charged with stalking, violation of a protective order, identity fraud, and illegal surveillance. The trial took place 8 months later, and I sat in that courtroom for 3 days, listening to prosecutors describe the scope of what he had done. The stalkerware on my phone had captured over 4,000 hours of audio. He had cloned my email accounts, my cloud storage, my social media. Everything I thought was private had been an open window for him to climb through. His defense attorney argued that he was mentally ill, that his obsession stemmed from a genuine belief that we were meant to be together. The jury did not buy it. They convicted him on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 7 years in state prison. I moved to a different city after the trial, somewhere I will not name, somewhere I have tried to build a life that does not revolve around looking over my shoulder every second of every day. Some nights I still wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain that I heard a noise outside my window. I check my phone for unfamiliar apps more often than I care to admit. The locks on my doors are the best money can buy, and I never park in the same spot twice. Vincent taught me that love can be a disguise, that attention can be a cage, and that some people will dismantle your entire sense of safety just to keep you close. I survived him, but I am not sure I will ever stop running. The year everything shifted. Life looked ordinary from the outside. Work had settled into a predictable rhythm. Evenings were quiet, and the relationship I was in had already lasted long enough to feel permanent. Friends knew us as the steady couple, the ones who didn't fight in public and showed up together to birthdays and holidays. I shared an apartment with someone I trusted deeply, someone who had once felt like a safe place after long days. Back then, my biggest worries were money and the feeling that my career had stalled. Nothing about my routine suggested danger, and that's probably why it took me so long to notice how much was changing inside our walls. The setback came quietly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow unraveling. A professional disappointment hit harder than I expected, and it bruised my confidence in ways I didn't know how to explain. The person I lived with reacted differently than I imagined, becoming unusually attentive at first, then oddly controlling in subtle ways. Questions started sounding less like concern and more like monitoring. Comments about my schedule, my phone, even the way I dressed began slipping into conversations disguised as jokes. None of it was loud or explosive, just a steady pressure that made home feel smaller each day. Friends were the first to notice something I couldn't fully articulate yet. I stopped answering messages quickly and started canceling plans without clear reasons. When I did show up, I was quieter, distracted, always checking the time. A close friend, Noah, asked once if everything was okay, and I remember brushing it off with a tired laugh. It was easier to downplay than to explain the constant tension that followed me around. I didn't have a single incident to point to, just a growing sense that I needed to be careful all the time. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere kept tightening. Doors were closed more often, conversations happened in lowered voices, and silence became a kind of warning. Small disagreements lingered far longer than they should have, stretched into hours of cold distance. I began memorizing routines, learning which topics to avoid and when to stay quiet. The relationship hadn't turned violent in any obvious way, which made it harder to name what was happening. Still, every day ended with the same thought. Whatever this had become, it wasn't what it used to be. What changed next didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It showed up in rules that were never spoken out loud. Certain friends suddenly became bad influences, according to casual comments dropped during dinner. If I stayed out later than expected, the mood at home shifted into something sharp and punishingly quiet. Personal things moved slightly from where I remembered leaving them, just enough to make me doubt myself. I began keeping track of tiny details without realizing why, like the position of keys or whether a light had been left on. Sleep came in fragments, and mornings felt heavier than they should have. Home no longer reset me. It drained me. The sense of being watched grew, even during moments that used to feel private. The fear didn't arrive all at once, which is what made it so confusing. It accumulated in my chest during ordinary moments like standing at the sink or scrolling through my phone. Certain questions started carrying consequences, and wrong answers led to long, suffocating evenings. I learned how to speak carefully, choosing words the way someone picks their steps on ice. Apologies became frequent, even when I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I stopped trusting my own reactions and relied instead on predicting theirs. The relationship had become a maze, and I was constantly trying not to hit the walls. Nothing dramatic happened, yet every day ended with relief that it was finally over. Friends kept checking in, and I kept deflecting. One of them, Marlon, noticed bruises under my eyes from lack of sleep, and asked again if I felt safe. The word safe stuck with me longer than the conversation itself. I laughed it off, saying things were just stressful at home, that everyone goes through rough patches. What I didn't say was how my body reacted to the sound of the front door opening. I didn't mention how my phone battery dying made my pulse spike. Admitting fear felt like betrayal, not just of my partner, but of the version of my life I'd presented to everyone else. So I stayed quiet and hoped it would pass. The day authorities became involved didn't start any differently than the others. Routine carried me through the morning, right up until a moment where the tension finally spilled beyond the apartment walls. A neighbor had heard raised voices and called for help, something I'd never done myself. When officers asked questions, my first instinct was still to minimize, to protect, to smooth things over. Then one of them asked how long I'd felt afraid. The answer surprised me as it left my mouth. Months, not days, not weeks, but months of slow, silent erosion. Saying it out loud made the truth impossible to ignore. Once the truth surfaced, Everything moved faster than I was prepared for. Statements were taken, questions repeated in different ways, and suddenly my private life felt exposed under fluorescent lights. I remember sitting on a stiff chair, hands clasped together trying to explain something that had never had a single starting point. There was no dramatic incident to describe, just a pattern that had slowly reshaped my days. The officers listened carefully, and one of them said something that stayed with me. Harm doesn't always leave visible marks. Hearing that felt validating and devastating at the same time. It meant what I'd lived through was real, but it also meant I'd been living in danger longer than I wanted to admit. Leaving the apartment didn't happen in a dramatic rush. It was methodical, almost clinical. I packed essentials while someone else stood nearby, making sure nothing escalated. Familiar objects looked different when I knew I wouldn't be coming back to them. The couch where I'd spent countless evenings felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. My partner barely spoke, and that silence felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Walking out with a bag over my shoulder felt unreal, like stepping off a stage after a performance that had gone on far too long. Relief came in waves, mixed with guilt I couldn't fully explain. In the weeks that followed, friends filled in the quiet spaces I hadn't realized were empty. Conversations happened slowly, carefully, as if everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I started noticing how tense my body had been, how simple things like sleeping through the night now felt like small victories. Therapy helped me understand how control can disguise itself as concern, how fear can become normalized when it grows gradually. I replayed moments from the past months and saw them differently, clearer, sharper. The danger hadn't appeared overnight. It had been assembling itself piece by piece while I adjusted instead of resisted. Today, I share this because I know how easy it is to miss the signs when nothing looks violent on the surface. What happened to me wasn't sudden, and that's what made it so dangerous. If someone had asked me earlier whether I was in trouble, I would have said no without hesitation. Now I know better. Safety isn't just the absence of bruises or shouting. It's the presence of peace. I'm still rebuilding, still learning to trust my instincts again. But I'm out. And even though I don't understand exactly when the line was crossed, I'm grateful I didn't wait any longer to leave. Living in a mid-sized apartment complex meant learning the rhythms of other people's lives whether you wanted to or not. At the time this happened, I was working irregular hours and sleeping lightly, always half aware of doors slamming or voices echoing through the courtyard. That night had the heavy quiet that usually settles after midnight, the kind where even small noises travel too far. I was scrolling on my phone on the couch, lights off, when raised voices cut straight through the walls. It wasn't playful arguing or drunk laughter, but sharp, brittle shouting that sounded rehearsed from long practice. I recognized the voices from the unit across the hall, a couple named Mason and Lily who had moved in months earlier. They were polite in passing, but the tension between them always lingered like a smell you couldn't place. Hearing them fight wasn't new, but the intensity that night felt different, more focused, like something had finally snapped. The argument spilled into the hallway, their door thrown open so hard it bounced against the frame. Mason's voice was loud enough that I could make out full sentences, accusations piling up without pause. Lily replied in shorter bursts, her tone clipped and controlled, which somehow made it worse. A few other doors cracked open an inch or two, just enough for eyes to peek through the dark. I stayed still, listening, telling myself not to get involved, the way everyone does in shared buildings. At one point, something heavy hit the wall inside their apartment, followed by a sharp thud on the floor. Then came a sudden stop, as if someone had flipped a switch. The door closed slowly this time, clicking into place with an oddly careful sound. After that, nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the building settling back into itself. Sleep never really came after that. My mind kept replaying the last few seconds, especially how deliberate that door sounded when it shut. Morning light crept in through the blinds, and by then the whole thing already felt unreal, like a bad dream fading at the edges. When I stepped into the hallway to take out trash, Mason was there, leaning against the wall and staring at his phone. He looked exhausted but strangely calm. Too calm for someone who'd been screaming hours earlier. He nodded at me and mentioned, casually, that Lily had taken off during the night after their fight. According to him, she grabbed a bag and left to cool down, something she'd done before. The way he said it felt practiced, like a line repeated until it sounded true. I remember thinking how odd it was that I hadn't heard the door open again. Later that day, the mood in the building shifted as quiet questions started circulating. One neighbor mentioned checking the security feed after realizing their car had been scratched overnight. The cameras covered the hallway and main exit, and curiosity turned into unease when people noticed gaps in the timeline. Lily never appeared leaving the building, not on foot, not through the garage, not anywhere the cameras could see. Someone else pointed out that her phone hadn't pinged outside the complex after the argument, based on a shared family plan notification. By evening, police were walking the halls, asking measured questions and taking notes. Standing in my doorway, watching them disappear into Mason's apartment, I felt a creeping certainty that the silence after that door closed wasn't empty at all. The next day blurred into a strange waiting period, like everyone in the building was holding their breath without admitting it. Officers returned with more questions, this time slower and more precise, asking about sounds, timing, even the way the argument ended. I told them about the hallway, the object hitting the wall, and how the door closed softly instead of slamming. One of them wrote that down and paused longer than the others, his pen hovering as if he didn't want to commit it to paper yet. Mason stayed inside his unit most of the day, curtains drawn, refusing to open the door unless prompted by police. When he did step out briefly to smoke, his movements were controlled, almost careful, as if every gesture was being rehearsed in his head. The story about Lily leaving stayed the same, word for word, no matter who asked. That consistency should have been reassuring, but it only made my unease deepen. By the following evening, the building manager mentioned that maintenance had been asked to check the plumbing in Mason's unit. Apparently, a neighbor below complained about unusual noises in the pipes during the night of the argument. I watched from my doorway as two maintenance workers went in with tool bags and came out quieter than they'd gone in. One of them wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, just shook his head slightly when the manager whispered something to him. Shortly after, the police arrived again, this time with gloves and sealed evidence bags. The air in the hallway felt thicker, like the walls were listening. Mason was escorted out, hands free but flanked closely, his face still calm in that unsettling way. As he passed me, he gave a quick nod, the same polite gesture he always used, and it made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, sleep was impossible again, but for different reasons. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors sharing fragments of what they'd heard from friends or overheard in stairwells. Someone mentioned phone records showing Lily's last call ended minutes after the door closed. Another said the security footage had been manually accessed around the same time, something only residents could do with the right code. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound from that night, wondering which ones I'd dismissed too quickly. The argument, the thud, the silence, all of it rearranged itself into something darker the more I thought about it. It struck me how normal the evening had felt before the shouting started, how easily a life could slip sideways without warning. Knowing I'd been just a wall away made the memory cling to me in an uncomfortable, personal way. The resolution came quietly, without the dramatic announcements people expect. Weeks later, the building received a brief notice confirming Mason had been charged, and that Lily's disappearance was no longer considered voluntary. Details were scarce, but enough leaked to confirm what most of us already suspected about what happened after that door closed. Life in the complex returned to its routine, new tenants moved in, and conversations shifted to safer topics. Still, every now and then, I catch myself listening too closely to the hallway at night, counting footsteps and door clicks. That careful sound of the lock turning has stayed with me more than the shouting ever did. Taught me how thin the line is between overhearing an argument and witnessing the beginning of something irreversible. Even now, thinking back on that day, It's the small details that refuse to fade. The way the hallway light flickered slightly after the door shut, like it hesitated. The smell of someone's burned dinner drifting through the vents minutes later, absurdly normal. I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, coffee going cold in my hands, staring at the wall we shared and trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Part of me wanted to believe Mason's version because it was easier, because it let the night stay contained. Accepting the alternative meant admitting I'd been close to something final and hadn't done a thing. That realization carried a quiet guilt that settled deep and stayed there. I replayed every choice I made during that night. Every moment I decided to stay put instead of stepping into the hall. It wasn't bravery that stopped me, just routine, the unspoken rule that you don't involve yourself in other people's messes. Friends I talked to later said the same thing. They wouldn't have done anything either. Still, that didn't make it easier to live with. The knowledge that Lily's last moments likely happened feet away from me turned the apartment into something unfamiliar. Sounds carried differently after that, each muffled noise charged with meaning. I started keeping my TV louder at night, not for entertainment, but to drown out the building itself. Eventually I moved out, not dramatically, just a lease ending and a quiet decision not to renew. On my last day there, I stood in the empty hallway for a moment, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Mason's unit was sealed and dark, a small notice still taped crookedly to the doorframe. New people would eventually live there, unaware of what had unfolded behind those walls. I wondered if they'd ever sense it, the way the air seemed heavier around that door. Leaving didn't erase the memory, but it gave it boundaries, a place I could point to and say, that happened there, not here. What stays with me most isn't fear, but awareness. That night taught me how ordinary horror can look until it's already finished. No warning signs flashing, no clear moment where intervention feels obvious. Just raised voices, a door closing, and a story that almost worked. I still think about Lily sometimes, about how easily she vanished from everyone's daily routine before the truth surfaced. Sharing this now isn't about closure, because I don't think that ever really arrives. It's about not letting that silence be the final thing remembered. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. September 2017 found me cleaning cabins on the Norwegian Spirit, somewhere between Juneau and Skagway. I'd been a cabin attendant for 3 weeks at that point, still getting used to the 12-hour shifts and the constant motion of the ship beneath my feet. Most people dream about Alaska cruises from the passenger side, glaciers, whales, 5-course dinners. From the crew side, it's fluorescent-lit corridors that smell like industrial cleaner, shared bunks 4 levels below the waterline, and the same 20 faces in the mess hall every single day. My section covered rooms 401 through 420 on deck 4, all balcony suites, which meant better tips but way more demanding guests who expected their towel animals to be perfect and their minibars restocked twice daily. Room 414 started giving me problems on a Thursday morning. Mrs. Gibson, a retired teacher from Phoenix traveling alone, pulled me aside in the hallway with this concerned expression that immediately told me something was wrong. She was maybe 70, wore these thick purple-framed glasses, and had that way of talking where she touched your arm every few sentences like she needed to make sure you were really listening. She said her balcony door kept opening on its own during the night, even though she distinctly remembered locking it before bed. The wind would wake her up at 3 or 4 in the morning, these icy gusts from the Alaskan waters just flooding her room. I assured her I'd check the lock mechanism, thinking maybe the ship's movement was jostling something loose, or the salt air had corroded the latch. That afternoon, I spent 20 minutes in 414 testing everything. The lock clicked firmly into place, The deadbolt slid smooth as butter, and the balcony door handle had zero give when I yanked on it from outside. I even checked the door frame for warping, ran my fingers along the weather stripping, tested if the ship's vibration could somehow trigger the mechanism. Nothing. Everything functioned perfectly. I left a maintenance request anyway, just to cover myself, and told Mrs. Gibson we'd replace the lock. We hadn't, but sometimes the placebo effect works wonders with anxious passengers. She seemed satisfied, even tipped me an extra 20 for being thorough. I figured that would be the end of it. 2 nights later, Mrs. Gibson was gone. Her cruise ended in Skagway, and the Johnsons from Michigan moved into 414. Harold and Vivian, mid-60s, celebrating their 40th anniversary. They seemed like the type who'd been on dozens of cruises, knew exactly how much to pack, which excursions were worth it, where to find the good coffee on board that wasn't $8 a cup. Harold wore these loud Hawaiian shirts every day, a different pattern, but always featuring parrots or pineapples. Vivian kept her silver hair in this perfect bob that never moved despite the deck winds. They were friendly enough, always asked about my family when I came to clean, remembered I was from Ohio. On their second night, I got a call from Harold at 6 a.m., right when I was starting my shift. The balcony door was wide open again, but that wasn't the worst part. Harold said they'd both woken up around 2 a.m. to this smell, like wet dog mixed with something metallic, he described it. Vivian thought maybe a seal or sea lion had somehow gotten onto their balcony, which would have been impossible at our cruising speed, but passengers always have wild theories. The smell lasted maybe 10 minutes, then vanished completely, but they couldn't get back to sleep after that. Harold mentioned feeling watched, said Vivian kept checking the bathroom and closet. They were both pretty shaken, and these weren't the type to spook easily. I promised to have maintenance do a deep inspection while they were at breakfast, even though I knew they'd find nothing, just like before. My supervisor, Craig, was getting annoyed with the repeated complaints about 414. He was this former Navy guy from Texas, treated the cruise ship like a military operation, everything by the book. He suggested maybe I wasn't locking the door properly during cleaning, which pissed me off, because I'd been doing this job long enough to know how to secure a damn door. But Craig had been with the company for 15 years, had connections all the way up to corporate, so I just nodded and said I'd be extra careful. That same day, the Johnsons asked to change rooms. We moved them to 408, told them there'd been a minor ventilation issue in 414. The lie came easy. In this job, you learn to smooth things over, keep the passengers happy, maintain the illusion that everything's perfect on their dream vacation. Room 414 stayed empty for one night due to a booking mix-up, which gave me a chance to really investigate. After my regular shift ended at 8 p.m., I told Craig I was grabbing dinner, but instead I went back to Deck 4. I had this weird feeling about that room, couldn't explain it, just knew something was wrong. The hallway was quieter than usual. Most passengers were at the comedy show in the main theater. I let myself into 414 with my master key and just sat there in the dark for a while, waiting. The room felt normal enough, maybe a little colder than the others, but that could have been my imagination. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, that distinctive shuffle of someone who's not quite awake. Through the peephole, I saw a man from 416, Mr. Carlson, standing in the corridor wearing just boxers and a t-shirt. No shoes, his feet probably freezing on that industrial carpet. Mr. Carlson was traveling with his wife and teenage daughter, seemed like a regular suburban dad, coached little league type, probably had a garage full of half-finished woodworking projects. But standing there in the hallway, he looked different. His eyes were open but unfocused, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. He walked straight to the door of 414 and just stood there, facing it, maybe 6 inches away. Didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood perfectly still. I watched him through the peephole for what must have been 5 full minutes, barely breathing myself, wondering if I should open the door and check if he was okay. His lips were moving slightly, like he was whispering something, but I couldn't make out any words. Then at exactly midnight, according to my phone, he turned around and walked back to 416. Went inside, and I heard the soft click of his door closing. The next morning, I made sure to be cleaning 416 when the Carlsons went to breakfast. Mr. Carlson looked completely normal, joking with his daughter about the whale-watching tour they'd booked, complaining good-naturedly about the coffee prices. I casually mentioned that I'd been doing some late-night maintenance in the hallway, asked if the noise had disturbed them. He looked genuinely confused, said they'd all slept like rocks. Best night's sleep of the whole cruise, actually. His wife confirmed it, said the motion of the ship usually kept her up, but last night she was out cold from 10 to 7. Their daughter, maybe 15 with braces and that awkward teenage posture, was buried in her phone but mumbled agreement. None of them had any memory of Mr. Carlson leaving the room. That's when I started keeping a log. Every night after my shift, I'd spend my break in the supply closet near 414, watching through the crack in the door. Night 3, Mrs. Brenner from 412, 70-something widow from Boston, stood at 414's door from 11:58 p.m. to 12:03 a.m., her gray hair wild from sleep, muttering what sounded like numbers. Night 4, a kid, maybe 8 years old, from 418, barefoot in dinosaur pajamas, pressing his palms flat against 414's door while his parents slept 3 rooms away. Night 5, 2 different people, Mr. Carlson again, and a woman from 410 I hadn't met yet, standing on either side of 414's door like guards, both swaying slightly with the ship's movement. Every single time they'd show up just before midnight, do their strange ritual, then return to their rooms with no memory of it the next day. I finally worked up the nerve to check 414's history in the ship's database. Had to bribe Danny from IT with a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving, but he got me access to the incident reports. Turns out 3 years earlier, a passenger named Eugene Whitfield had been found dead in 414. 62 years old, traveling alone, discovered by housekeeping after he missed 2 days of meals. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but the notes mentioned he'd been found on the balcony at noon, despite having died around midnight according to the coroner's estimate. His body was in a kneeling position, facing the ocean, arms stretched out like he was reaching for something. The crew member who found him said the smell was unbearable, not just death but something else, something chemical. Security footage from that night showed nothing unusual, Eugene entering his room at 10 p.m. and never leaving. But here's what made my skin prickle. They found scratch marks on the inside of the balcony door, deep gouges in the wood like he'd been trying to claw his way back inside. I should have reported everything to Craig, should have insisted they close 414 permanently or at least investigate properly. But cruise lines don't work that way. Every empty room is lost revenue. Every incident is potential bad publicity. Plus, who'd believe me? Passengers sleepwalking to a specific door at midnight sounded insane even to me. Instead, I started leaving 414's balcony door slightly open before midnight. Just a crack, barely noticeable. My theory was maybe Eugene's spirit or energy or whatever you want to call it was trapped, trying to get back in, using other passengers as conduits. The strange thing was, it actually worked. The sleepwalking stopped immediately. No more midnight visitors, no more complaints about the smell or feeling watched. The room still felt wrong to me, heavy somehow, but at least people weren't being drawn to it anymore. I finished my contract 2 months later and never went back to cruise work. Got a job at a Marriott in Columbus, boring as hell, but at least the rooms stay where they're supposed to. Sometimes I Google the Norwegian Spirit, check cruise forums to see if anyone mentions room 414. Found one post from last year, a woman complaining that her balcony door wouldn't stay closed, kept finding it open every morning despite locking it multiple times. The cruise line responded with some corporate nonsense about investigating the matter, ensuring passenger comfort, the usual script. But I know what's really happening. Every night at midnight, something in that room needs to get out, needs to reach the ocean, needs to complete whatever Eugene was trying to do in his final moments. And some poor cabin attendant is probably discovering what I discovered, making the same choice I made, leaving that door cracked open and hoping nobody asks too many questions. I still dream about it sometimes. That hallway, those sleepwalking passengers, their blank eyes and shuffling feet. In the dreams, I'm the one standing at 414's door at midnight, my hand reaching for the handle, my mouth moving in silent words I can't understand. I always wake up right before the door opens, drenched in sweat, checking my phone to make sure it's not midnight. Part of me wonders if Eugene had the same dreams before his trip, if something called him to that specific room, that specific fate. But mostly I try not to think about it. Some doors, I've learned, are meant to stay open, even when every instinct tells you to lock them tight and throw away the key. I worked security on cruise ships for 12 years before that night in the Mediterranean changed everything. It was late August 2018, and I was stationed aboard the Celestial Dream, one of those floating cities that promised paradise to 3,000 passengers willing to pay for it. My shift ran from midnight to 8 in the morning, monitoring the endless maze of corridors and decks through 36 different camera feeds. Most nights, I'd see nothing more exciting than drunk passengers stumbling back to their cabins or the occasional couple sneaking into the pool after hours. That particular night started like any other. Me, a thermos of black coffee, and the soft glow of monitors in the security office tucked away on Deck 3. The ship was somewhere between Santorini and Malta, cutting through calm waters under a moonless sky. I remember the exact time because I'd just logged it in my report, 2:47 a.m., when I first noticed her on camera 14, the one covering the portside promenade on Deck 7. She was wearing this flowing white sundress that caught my attention immediately, not because it was unusual, but because of how she moved in it. The woman kept pulling at the hem, wrapping her arms around herself, then unwrapping them, looking behind her every few steps like she expected someone to materialize from the shadows. Her hair, this distinctive auburn color that looked almost burgundy under the deck lights, whipped around her face in the sea breeze. I zoomed in slightly, following protocol to assess if a passenger might need assistance. She walked the entire length of the promenade twice, her pace irregular, sometimes quick and purposeful, other times slowing to an almost complete stop. At one point, she gripped the railing and leaned forward, staring down at the black water below for what must have been a full minute. I reached for my radio, ready to dispatch someone to check on her, but then she stepped back, smoothed down her dress, and continued walking. The way she kept checking her phone, the screen lighting up her face with this harsh blue glow, made me think she was waiting for someone, or maybe having one of those late-night arguments couples have on vacation when the romance doesn't quite live up to the brochure. Around 3:15 a.m., a man appeared on the same camera feed. Tall guy, maybe 6'2", wearing khaki shorts and a navy polo that looked freshly pressed even at that ungodly hour. He had this particular way of walking, shoulders back, chin up, like he was perpetually posing for a yacht club photo. I recognized him immediately as one half of the couple from cabin 8247, one of those luxury suites with the private balconies that cost more than I made in 3 months. They'd been on board since Barcelona, always ate at the captain's table, tipped the staff generously, the kind of passengers crew members remember because they never complain and always smile. He approached the woman slowly, and I watched her whole body language shift. Her shoulders dropped, she stopped fidgeting with her dress, but she also took this tiny step backward that most people wouldn't notice. When he reached her, he put his hand on her lower back, that possessive gesture some men do, and they started walking together toward the stern. She kept her arms crossed the entire time, her head turned slightly away from him, looking out at the water instead of at her husband. I switched between cameras to keep them in view, camera 14 to 15, then 16 as they moved aft. They stopped near the very back of the ship, where the deck narrows and the railing is lower, right by the emergency equipment lockers. This area has always made me nervous because the cameras don't overlap perfectly there. There's about a 12-foot section where you can only see people from one angle, and if they move close to the railing, their lower bodies get cut off from view. The husband was doing most of the talking, his hands moving in these controlled, measured gestures, while she just stood there, occasionally nodding. At 3:28 a.m., she suddenly turned to walk away, but he caught her wrist, not aggressively, just firm enough to stop her. They stood like that for maybe 30 seconds, him still talking, her looking down at where his hand gripped her arm. Then she said something. I could see her mouth moving rapidly, almost like she was pleading, and he let go. She immediately walked out of frame, heading toward the port side, and he followed about 10 feet behind. That's when I made my first mistake. I didn't switch cameras fast enough to see where they went next. Got distracted by a drunk passenger vomiting in a stairwell on deck 5 that required immediate attention. By the time I got back to tracking them, maybe 3 minutes later, I caught the husband on camera 18, walking alone near the midship elevators. His clothes looked exactly the same, not a wrinkle, not a hair out of place. But something about his walk was different now, looser, more relaxed, like someone who just finished a workout and was cooling down. He pressed the elevator button, waited precisely 15 seconds, I counted, then took the stairs instead, heading up toward the Lido deck. I scanned through all the port side cameras looking for the woman in the white dress, figuring she'd gone back to their cabin another way. Camera 12, nothing. Camera 13, empty corridor. Camera 14, where I'd first seen her. Just the empty promenade and the occasional spray of seawater hitting the deck. I pulled up the interior cameras next, checked the ladies' rooms on that level, the 24-hour cafe that stayed open for insomniacs and party stragglers. She wasn't anywhere. At 3:41 a.m., I made a note in my log that I'd lost visual on a female passenger. Standard procedure, when someone exits camera coverage without returning to their cabin. The husband showed up on my monitors again at 4:05 a.m., this time at the casino bar on deck 8. He ordered what looked like whiskey neat, I could tell by the way the bartender poured it, and sat there sipping it slowly while scrolling through his phone. Nothing about his behavior suggested anything unusual. He even laughed at something on his screen, showed it to the bartender who smiled politely. After finishing his drink, he walked back to cabin 8247, used his key card, and disappeared inside. I kept expecting to see the woman in the white dress appear on one of my screens, maybe coming from the spa area or the library, somewhere the cameras don't cover every angle, but she never did. At 6:15 a.m., just as the sun was starting to paint the horizon this pale orange color, the husband emerged from his cabin again. This time he was wearing running gear, those expensive athletic shorts with the reflective strips and a moisture-wicking shirt. He did a full circuit of the jogging track on deck 11, maintaining a steady pace for exactly 45 minutes. When he passed other early morning joggers, he'd give them this friendly little wave, the perfect image of a health-conscious passenger enjoying his Mediterranean vacation. My shift was almost over when the call came in at 7:42 a.m. The husband, now dressed in crisp linen pants and a white button-down, was at the guest services desk reporting his wife missing. Even from the camera angle above the desk, I could see his performance, the way he ran his fingers through his hair repeatedly, how he kept touching his wedding ring, spinning it around his finger while he talked. The duty manager called up to security immediately, and suddenly my quiet night became a circus. The husband's story was simple. His wife, Isabel, had gone for a walk around 3 a.m. because she couldn't sleep. He'd tried to go with her, but she insisted she needed some time alone to clear her head. They'd been having some minor disagreements about their next port of call, nothing serious. He went back to their cabin to wait, dozed off, and when he woke up at 7, she still hadn't returned. Her side of the bed was untouched, her phone was going straight to voicemail, and her passport was still in the cabin safe. The tears that rolled down his cheeks looked so genuine that even the duty manager put a comforting hand on his shoulder. I pulled all the footage from 2:30 a.m. onward and brought it to the security chief's office. We sat there watching it together on the main screen while 2 other officers began coordinating a ship-wide search. When we got to the part where the couple was at the stern, near those emergency lockers, the chief asked me to replay it 3 times. Each time we watched the husband's hand on her back, the way she tried to leave, how he grabbed her wrist. But the chief just shrugged, looked like a standard marital spat to him, the kind they see a dozen times per cruise. Then I showed him something else, At 3:31 a.m., right after the couple walked out of camera 16's view, there was this tiny splash visible in camera 17, which covers the wake behind the ship. Just a small disturbance in the water, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Could have been anything, a wave, a seabird, someone throwing a cigarette overboard. But then at 3:33 a.m., the husband appeared again on camera 18, and if you looked closely, really closely, his right pocket seemed heavier than before, pulling slightly on that side of his shorts. When he'd first appeared at 3:15, both pockets had been flat against his legs. The search went on for 6 hours. Every cabin, every storage room, every possible space where a person could be. They even sent crew members to check inside the lifeboats and behind the industrial equipment in areas passengers never see. The Coast Guard was notified, and we had to reduce speed while they conducted their protocols. Meanwhile, the husband, his name was Jonathan, I learned from the passenger manifest, put on this masterclass in grief. He helped with the search, knocked on doors with the crew, called out Isabel's name until his voice went hoarse. When they brought him back to the security office to review his statement, he broke down completely, had to be given water and tissues. He kept saying the same things over and over. She'd been stressed about her work back home. She'd been taking sleeping pills, but they made her feel foggy. Sometimes she'd go for walks to clear her head. He mentioned she'd been talking about wanting to see the sunrise from the deck. Maybe she'd leaned too far over the railing. The way he delivered each line, with these perfectly timed pauses and voice cracks, reminded me of my brother who did community theater. Technically perfect, but somehow rehearsed. At 2 p.m., after the captain made the announcement that we had a missing passenger and asked everyone to check their areas, I went back to the footage one more time on my own. This time, I focused on the 20 minutes after I'd lost them on camera 16. At 3:34 a.m., there was something I'd missed before. On camera 22, which covers the service corridor behind the pool area, a figure walked past carrying something white bundled under their arm. The quality was terrible because that's one of our older cameras, but the height and build matched Jonathan. The white bundle could have been towels, could have been a bathrobe from the spa, or it could have been a white sundress. At 3:38 a.m., that same figure appeared on camera 24 near the incinerator chute that crew members use for garbage from the restaurants. They stood there for exactly 43 seconds, then walked away, empty-handed. I tried to enhance the image, even borrowed a laptop from IT to run it through better software, but the resolution just wasn't there. All I had was a pixelated ghost who might or might not have been throwing evidence into an incinerator that reaches 1,000 degrees Celsius. I brought everything to the chief again. The splash, the heavy pocket, the figure with the white bundle, the incinerator timing. He looked at me like I'd been drinking on duty. The splash could have been anything. Pockets can look different depending on the camera angle, and half the crew uses that service corridor at night. Without clear footage, without a body, without any real evidence, all we had was a woman who'd tragically fallen overboard, probably while her husband slept. The investigators who came aboard in Malta interviewed everyone, including me. I told them what I'd seen, showed them the footage I'd flagged. They took notes, nodded politely, and focused their questions on Isabel's mental state instead. Jonathan had already given them her psychiatrist's contact information, proof she'd been treated for anxiety and insomnia. He'd even found a note in her journal about feeling trapped, though when I asked to see the actual journal, they said it was personal evidence. By the time we docked, the official story was already written. Tragic accident, troubled woman, Mediterranean cruise turns to nightmare. Jonathan left the ship surrounded by sympathetic crew members who'd pooled together money for a condolence gift. But here's what haunts me, what made me quit that job 3 months later, and still keeps me up some nights. When I was packing up Isabel's belongings for Jonathan, standard procedure for missing passenger cases, I found her sleeping pills in the bathroom, a full bottle, prescription dated just 2 days before the cruise. 30 pills, and 30 were still there. Her phone, which Jonathan said she'd taken with her, found it wedged between the mattress and headboard, like it had fallen while she was sleeping. And that jewelry he'd thrown overboard at 3:31, because I know now that's what it was. Probably her wedding ring, maybe a necklace, something to make it look like she'd gone into the water. The investigators said these details didn't change anything. Lots of people forget to take their medication. Phones fall all the time. But I know what I saw in those cameras. I know the difference between a man whose wife just tragically died and a man who just got away with murder. Jonathan knew exactly where our camera blind spots were, knew the incinerator schedule, knew that without a body, maritime law made everything complicated. I still check news stories from his hometown sometimes, wondering if he'll remarry, if he's already planning another cruise. Because guys like him, they don't stop at one. The Atlantic was eerily calm that April night in 2022, when everything I thought I knew about maritime safety came crashing down around me. I was working as a junior communications officer aboard the Meridian Star, one of those massive repositioning cruises that ferry passengers from Florida to Europe when the season changes. At 26, I'd only been with the company for 8 months, still green enough that the senior officers called me rookie, but experienced enough to handle the graveyard shift alone. The ship was carrying about 1,800 passengers, mostly retirees taking advantage of the cheaper repositioning rates, and by 2 a.m., the entire vessel felt like a floating ghost town. I remember sitting in the communications room on Deck 9, monitoring the usual channels while sipping my 4th cup of coffee that shift, when the first transmission came through, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. The voice was barely a whisper through the static, like someone speaking through layers of wet fabric, repeating the same thing over and over. Mayday, Mayday, this is position 27.4 north, 63.8 west. Please, anyone. They're taking on water. I immediately sat up straighter, adjusting the frequency dial with practiced precision, trying to clear up the signal. According to protocol, any distress call requires immediate action, so I grabbed the logbook and started recording everything while simultaneously pulling up our navigation charts. The coordinates placed the source about 40 nautical miles southeast of our current position, close enough that we could potentially assist if needed. But here's where things got strange. When I tried to respond to establish communication, my transmission seemed to hit a wall of interference. The voice kept repeating, growing more desperate with each loop. And I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The person never identified their vessel, just kept saying, "This is," followed by static, as if the ship's name was being deliberately obscured. Following standard procedure, I contacted the bridge immediately to report the distress signal. Lieutenant Commander Reeves answered after 3 rings, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. When I explained the situation, playing back the recording I'd started making, he went quiet for a long moment, before telling me to run a verification check with the Coast Guard and MRCC Atlantic. I did exactly that, sending out queries to every maritime authority in the region, but their responses all came back the same. No vessels reported missing or in distress at those coordinates, no emergency beacons activated, nothing on their radar. Reeves called back 20 minutes later, and I could hear other senior officers in the background. Apparently, I'd woken up half the command structure. He told me it was probably just atmospheric interference bouncing old transmissions around, something that happens occasionally over deep water, and to log it as a false alarm. But the voice was still coming through my headset, clearer now, and I could hear other sounds behind it. Metal groaning, water rushing, people screaming in what sounded like Portuguese or Spanish. I couldn't just ignore it. Not when every instinct I had was screaming that something was terribly wrong. After Reeves hung up, I made a decision that probably should have gotten me fired. I started my own investigation. First, I pulled up historical maritime data for those exact coordinates, using the ship's archived navigation database that went back nearly 50 years. What I found made my mouth go dry. On May 15, 1976, a cruise liner called the Estrella Pacifica had sent out a distress call from those exact coordinates, 27.4 north, 63.8 west. before vanishing without a trace. All 247 souls on board were never found. No wreckage was ever recovered, and the investigation was closed after 6 months with no conclusive explanation. The official report, which I managed to access through our company's internal network, blamed it on a rogue wave, but the weather that night had been completely calm, just like tonight. The distress calls continued for another hour, growing more frantic and layered. Multiple voices now overlapping in different languages, all broadcasting from those same coordinates. I recorded everything on my personal phone, knowing the ship's official recordings would probably be deleted or lost if this turned into something bigger. Around 3:30 a.m., I noticed something else in the ship's database that made me physically push back from my desk. Our parent company, Meridian Cruise Lines, had acquired its fleet in 1977, just 1 year after the Estrella Pacifica disappeared. The previous owner? Pacific Star Ventures, the same company that had operated the Estrella Pacifica. Even more disturbing, 3 of our current board members had been executives at Pacific Star during the time of the disappearance. I started downloading everything I could find, transferring files to my personal laptop, when suddenly all the screens in the communications room went black for about 10 seconds before flickering back to life. When the systems came back online, the distress signal had changed. Now there was just one voice, crystal clear, speaking in accented English. They knew we were sinking. They knew, and they left us here. The Meridian directors. They cut our communications, disabled our beacons. Insurance fraud. Please, someone needs to know the truth. Check the maintenance logs for April 1976. Check the transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched tone that made me rip off my headset. My nose was bleeding. I didn't even realize it until I felt the warm drip on my uniform. I grabbed tissues while frantically trying to restore the connection, but the frequency was dead. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, which was unusual because nobody ever came up to Deck 9 during the night shift, except for hourly security rounds, and the next one wasn't due for another 40 minutes. The door to the communications room opened slowly, and in walked Chief Communications Officer Garrett, a man who typically worked day shifts and whom I'd only met twice during my entire employment. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a wrinkled polo shirt, like he'd been roused from bed and threw on whatever was nearby. His face had this practiced calm that didn't match the urgency in his eyes, and he was carrying a tablet that he kept glancing at nervously. "Aaron," he said, using my first name for the first time ever, "I heard you've been picking up some unusual interference tonight. Mind if I take a look at your logs?" The way he said it wasn't really a question. I handed him the official logbook, but I could tell he was more interested in seeing what was on my computer screen. He scrolled through the entries, occasionally making small humming sounds, then asked me to play back the recordings from the ship's system. Of course, when I tried to access them, they were gone. Every single transmission from the last 3 hours had been wiped clean, showing nothing but normal channel monitoring. Garrett's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Must have been a system glitch," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Happens sometimes with all the satellite interference out here. I'll need you to write up an incident report stating that you experienced technical anomalies, but nothing of concern was found upon investigation." He pulled out a pre-written template on his tablet, already filled out with most of the details, just waiting for my signature. That's when I knew for certain that this went all the way to the top. They'd been monitoring my access to the database, watching me discover the connections, and now they were here to clean it up. I signed the report. What else could I do? But I made sure to take a photo of it with my phone when Garrett looked away for a second. He collected the official logbook, told me to take the rest of the night off, and suggested I might enjoy working on one of our Mediterranean routes after this crossing. Maybe take some vacation time. Think about my future with the company. I left the communications room knowing they'd be watching me now, but I couldn't let it go. Not with those voices still echoing in my head. Not with 247 people who never got justice. Over the next 2 days, I acted completely normal during my shifts. But at night, I used the passenger Wi-Fi on my personal laptop to research everything I could about the Estrella Pacifica. I found an old conspiracy forum where someone claiming to be a former Pacific Star employee had posted in 2008 about falsified maintenance records and deliberately compromised hull integrity on several vessels for insurance payouts. The post mentioned that the Estrella Pacifica was supposed to develop a controlled leak that would force an evacuation near a busy shipping lane, but something went catastrophically wrong. The user disappeared after 3 posts, their account deleted, but other users had screenshot everything. I also found obituaries for 2 other Pacific Star executives from 1976 who died in separate accidents within weeks of the Estrella Pacifica disaster. Both had been vocal about investigating discrepancies in the company's fleet maintenance. On my final night shift before reaching Barcelona, around 1 a.m., the signals returned stronger than ever. This time I could hear individual voices clearly. A woman singing a lullaby in Portuguese to calm someone, a man praying in Latin, children crying for their parents. But the most chilling was a calm male voice that spoke directly to me. Aaron Blackwood, Junior Communications Officer, Employee ID 7739. We know you're listening. We know you've seen the truth. Don't let them bury us twice. The fact that they knew my full name and employee ID made my entire body go cold. I'd never transmitted that information, never spoken it aloud in the communications room. Then he continued. In 12 hours, check the Barcelona Herald archives for May 16, 1976, page 14. The truth they couldn't completely erase. The transmission ended with what sounded like hundreds of voices whispering coordinates, those same coordinates, over and over, until I had to turn off the entire communications array just to make it stop. Once we docked in Barcelona, I was one of the first crew members off the ship. I went straight to the Barcelona Central Library, my heart pounding the entire metro ride there. The Barcelona Herald archives from 1976 were on microfilm in the basement, and it took me an hour to find May 16th. Page 14 was mostly shipping news and port schedules, but at the bottom corner was a small article that made everything click into place. Pacific Star Ventures announces record insurance settlement. The article mentioned that the company had received the largest maritime insurance payout in history, following the loss of the Estrella Pacifica, enough to purchase an entire new fleet of state-of-the-art vessels with enhanced safety features. The amount was $450 million in 1976 money. But here's the detail that chilled me. The insurance claim had been filed on May 14th, a full day before the Estrella Pacifica sent its distress signal. I photographed everything, made copies, and sent them to 3 different journalists, 2 maritime safety organizations, and uploaded everything to multiple cloud servers. I knew my career with Meridian was over, but those voices deserved to be heard. Within a week of my documents going public, Meridian's stock plummeted 40%, and a joint investigation was launched by maritime authorities from 6 different countries. I was fired, of course, officially for violating company confidentiality agreements and causing reputational damage through unsubstantiated claims. But 2 months later, a team of deep-sea investigators found the Estrella Pacifica exactly at those coordinates, sitting upright on the ocean floor, with evidence of explosive damage to the hull that couldn't have been caused by any natural phenomenon. The investigation is still ongoing, but 3 board members have already resigned, and families of the victims have filed a class action lawsuit. I still wake up sometimes at 2 a.m., thinking I can hear those voices calling out from the dark waters of the Atlantic. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but part of me wonders if they're still out there, waiting for full justice. I work as a freelance maritime safety consultant now, and I've made it my mission to ensure that no company can ever bury the truth, or people, like that again. Every time I cross the Atlantic, I always say a quiet prayer when we pass those coordinates. 27.4 north, 63.8 west. They may have been silenced in 1976, but not anymore. The Caribbean Princess wasn't my first choice for a vacation, but after my divorce was finalized in October 2023, my sister Nancy convinced me I needed to get away from everything. I was 34, working as a dental hygienist in Denver, and honestly just wanted to spend a week where nobody knew my story or asked how I was holding up. The ship was massive, one of those floating cities with 7 restaurants, 3 pools, and enough activities to keep you busy 24 hours a day if you wanted. I'd been on board for 3 days when everything went sideways during what should have been the highlight of the trip, this sunset cocktail party they threw on the Lido deck every Wednesday. The brochure called it Golden Hour Celebration, and they'd been hyping it up since we left port in Miami. I remember exactly what I was wearing that evening. This ridiculous tropical print dress Nancy had bought me as a joke, with these bright yellow pineapples all over it. The party started around 6:30, and by 7, the deck was packed with probably 200 people, everyone holding these orange and pink drinks that came with little paper umbrellas and chunks of fresh mango on the rim. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, painting everything in these deep amber tones that made even strangers look like old friends. I was standing near the portside railing with this couple from Canada, the Andersons, who'd been at my dinner table the night before. We were laughing about how Mrs. Anderson's husband kept trying to convince her to enter the hairy chest contest when we heard this sound. Not quite a scream, more like a sharp intake of breath from about 50 people all at once. Everyone near the starboard railing was pointing and shouting, and I saw this 20-something guy in a backwards baseball cap climbing up on one of those white metal benches to get a better view. The music, some generic steel drum version of Margaritaville, kept playing for another 10 seconds before somebody finally cut it. That's when I heard the actual words people were yelling. "Man in the water! Someone went over! Stop the ship!" I pushed through the crowd, still holding my drink like an idiot, until I could see past the wall of backs pressed against the railing. There, in the churning wake maybe 40 feet behind us, was a person. Just a dark shape, really. Arms flailing, getting smaller every second as the ship continued moving at full speed. The water around them was this sickening mix of white foam and deep blue, and I could see their head disappearing and reappearing between the waves our massive hull was creating. My first instinct was to throw something, a life preserver, anything, but when I looked around, all those safety rings that are usually hanging every 20 feet were somehow missing from their hooks. This woman next to me, wearing these huge cat-eye sunglasses even though the sun was almost down, was recording everything on her phone, holding it steady with both hands while tears streamed down her face. "We have to do something," she kept saying. But nobody moved. The crew members who'd been serving drinks 30 seconds earlier had vanished. I watched that person in the water for maybe another minute, the longest minute I've ever experienced, before they simply weren't there anymore. The spot where they'd been was just empty ocean, getting darker as the sun continued its descent like nothing had happened. The next 20 minutes were chaos. People were screaming at any crew member they could find, demanding the captain stop the ship, reverse course, call the Coast Guard, something. This older man with a thick Brooklyn accent grabbed a young server by the shoulders and just kept repeating, "There's a person back there, a human being." But the staff all had the same response. They needed to verify the incident through proper channels. They couldn't act on passenger reports alone. Protocol had to be followed. I watched 3 different people pull out their phones to call 911, only to remember we were in international waters with no cell service. The woman who'd been recording, whose name I learned was Bethany, was showing her video to anyone who would look, practically shoving her phone in crew members' faces. The footage was clear as day. You could see the person go over the railing during some kind of struggle or commotion near the bar, though the crowd had blocked most of the actual fall. By the time security showed up, maybe 30 minutes after it happened, they acted like we were all drunk or hysterical. The head of security, this enormous bald guy with arms like ham hocks and a name tag that said Chief Walker, announced that no incident had been reported through official channels. When about 40 of us started shouting at once, he held up his hand and said they'd review the ship's CCTV footage, but that passengers needed to return to their cabins or evening activities immediately. The party area was being closed for maintenance. I watched them herd everyone toward the exits while 2 crew members started folding up the bar and stacking chairs like they were closing a restaurant after a normal night. Bethany was standing her ground, still trying to show Chief Walker her video, when he finally took her phone, watched about 3 seconds and handed it back, saying he'd need her to file a formal report in the security office on deck 2. I went with Bethany to the security office because honestly, I didn't trust them not to do something to her if she went alone. The office was this windowless room behind the casino, reeking of cigarette smoke, even though smoking was supposedly banned indoors. We sat in these uncomfortable plastic chairs for an hour before anyone would talk to us. When someone finally came, a different security officer with acne scars and nervous eyes who wouldn't give his name, he had Bethany fill out this form that was clearly designed for reporting lost jewelry or noise complaints, not someone going overboard. She had to write the incident in a tiny box marked "Nature of Complaint." While she wrote, I noticed the officer kept glancing at this mounted camera in the corner of the room, the red recording light blinking steadily. Bethany tried to show him the video again, and this time he actually watched the whole thing, his face going pale when you could clearly see the person hitting the water. He said he'd need to make a copy for their investigation and asked for her room number so they could return her phone later. That was the first red flag I should have paid attention to. Why would they need to keep her phone to make a copy? But Bethany was exhausted and frustrated, and she just wanted someone to take this seriously, so she handed it over. The officer gave her a receipt on this flimsy piece of paper that looked like something from a grocery store, promised someone from senior staff would follow up within 24 hours, and ushered us out. When we got back to the main promenade, it was like stepping into an alternate universe. The nightly show was starting in the theater, people were laughing at the comedy club, and the casino was packed with seniors feeding dollar bills into slot machines. I heard 2 crew members near the photo shop talking in hushed voices, and I distinctly caught the words "standard procedure" and "Miami office," but they stopped the second they saw me looking. The next morning I knocked on Bethany's cabin door around 8. She answered, looking like she hadn't slept at all, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Her phone had been returned, slid under her door at 3 a.m. according to the timestamp on the envelope. But when she opened her photo gallery to show me, her face went white. Every single video and photo from the previous day was gone. Not just the incident footage, but everything. The sunset pics she'd taken earlier, selfies from dinner, random shots of towel animals the steward had made. In their place were her photos from the previous days, but October 11th just didn't exist in her phone anymore. She showed me her recently deleted folder. Empty. She checked her cloud backup. The auto sync had mysteriously been turned off sometime during the night. When she went to her phone's settings, the last backup was showing as October 10th at 11:47 p.m., even though she distinctly remembered checking Instagram in bed after midnight. We went straight back to the security office, but this time they had 2 large men in suits waiting outside who said the office was closed for administrative processing until further notice. Bethany started raising her voice, demanding to speak to Chief Walker, asking what they'd done to her phone. One of the suits, wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors like some movie villain, stepped forward and suggested in this very calm, very threatening tone that she might want to consider her safety and the safety of other passengers before making unsubstantiated accusations that could cause unnecessary panic. When I tried to intervene, saying I was a witness too, he turned those mirror lenses toward me and asked for my cabin number and full name. The way he wrote it down in this little leather notebook, taking his time with each letter, made my chest tight with fear. Bethany grabbed my arm and pulled me away, whispering that we needed to find the Andersons and anyone else who'd seen what happened. But finding witnesses proved harder than we expected. The Andersons weren't at breakfast, and when we went to their cabin, a steward cleaning the hallway mentioned they'd been relocated to a different deck due to a plumbing issue. The couple from Kentucky who'd been standing right next to us during the incident suddenly couldn't remember seeing anything clearly. The husband kept repeating that it had been getting dark. Maybe it was just debris or a dolphin. The woman with the cat-eye sunglasses who'd been crying. Nobody had seen her since last night. At lunch, I overheard a crew member telling another passenger that sometimes people think they see things at sea, that the light playing on the waves can create optical illusions, and that the ship had sensors that would automatically detect if anyone went overboard. This was a lie. I'd Googled it in the business center that morning. Those sensors exist, but most cruise ships don't have them because they're not legally required to. Around 3 that afternoon, Bethany texted me to come to her cabin immediately. When I got there, she was packing frantically, throwing clothes into her suitcase without folding them. She'd just gotten off the phone with her husband back home. She'd managed to call him from the ship's satellite phone at $8 a minute. She'd told him everything, and he'd said he was contacting a maritime lawyer and the Coast Guard. But here's the thing that made my skin prickle. Within 5 minutes of that call, she'd received a visit from the hotel director, the captain's direct representative, informing her that she was being confined to quarters for the remainder of the voyage due to safety concerns regarding her deteriorating mental state. They'd posted a security guard outside her door. I'd walked right past him, some 19-year-old kid who looked scared out of his mind. She had 1 hour to pack because they were moving her to what they called a supervised accommodation on Deck 1, which everyone knows is where they keep the morgue and the brig. I helped Bethany hide her passport and credit cards in her bra, and we came up with a plan. I would take photos of everything: the security guard, any documents they gave her, the room they put her in, and email them to her husband using the business center computers since my phone mysteriously stopped connecting to the ship's Wi-Fi after leaving the security office. But when I tried to leave her cabin, the guard blocked my path. He had a radio, and whatever voice crackled through it made him step aside, but not before telling me I had 10 minutes to return to my own cabin for a mandatory safety drill. There was no safety drill scheduled. I ran to the business center, but my keycard wouldn't open the door. The library, same thing. The customer service desk had a sign saying they were closed for staff training, even though it was the middle of their posted hours. Every single place where I could have contacted the outside world was suddenly inaccessible. I went back to my cabin and used the room phone to call my sister Nancy, but the call wouldn't connect to any number outside the ship. That night, they made an announcement that we'd be skipping our scheduled port in Cozumel due to unfavorable weather conditions, though the ocean was calm as glass. I never saw Bethany again. The next morning, her name wasn't on the dinner seating chart, and when I asked our waiter about her, he looked confused and said there had always been 7 people at our table, not 8. The Andersons were back, acting perfectly normal but refusing to make eye contact with me. On the last day, as we approached Miami, I was called to the purser's desk and informed that there had been an error with my onboard account. I was receiving a full refund for my cruise, and a future cruise credit worth double what I'd paid. All I had to do was sign a simple form acknowledging the computer error and agreeing that my experience had been satisfactory despite the minor inconvenience. The form's fine print was extensive. I signed it. I was scared not to. But I took photos of every page with my phone, which had miraculously started working again once we were in U.S. waters. The man who went overboard was never mentioned in any news outlet. Bethany's social media accounts were deleted. When I tried to look her up 3 months later, it was like she'd never existed. But I know what I saw. We all saw it. And somewhere there's a cruise line policy written in corporate speak that explains exactly how to make these things disappear. The adults-only quiet pool on Deck 14 of the Pacific Voyager was supposed to be the easiest lifeguard assignment on the entire ship. That's what my supervisor told me when I got hired in early 2015, fresh out of getting my advanced water safety certification in Nevada. Most cruise passengers who chose that particular pool were in their 60s and 70s, preferring the peaceful atmosphere over the chaotic main pools below. They'd float on expensive inflatable loungers, sip their mojitos, and read paperback novels under the retractable glass canopy that kept the ocean breeze from disturbing their relaxation. I was 24 then, needed the money to pay off student loans, and figured watching retirees paddle around for 4 months at sea would be a decent way to save up while seeing parts of the Pacific I'd only dreamed about. My shift ran from noon to 8 p.m. every day, and for the first 2 weeks of that particular voyage in June, everything followed the same predictable pattern. Mrs. Fitzgerald would arrive at exactly 12:30 with her needlepoint, always choosing the same cushioned chair near the shallow end. Mr. and Mrs. Huang would claim their spot under the largest umbrella, where they'd play cards until dinner. A gentleman everyone called Professor Jim would swim precisely 40 laps, counting each one out loud in this raspy whisper that carried across the water. The pool had a capacity of maybe 50 people, but rarely saw more than 20 at a time, and most days I'd spend more time adjusting umbrellas and fetching extra towels than actually watching for any real emergencies. Things started getting weird on a Wednesday afternoon when I noticed this woman I'd never seen before hanging around the pool area. She wore oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat that covered most of her face. But what caught my attention wasn't her appearance. It was how she kept walking past the pool without ever getting in. She'd circle the deck maybe 3 or 4 times an hour, always slowing down near the storage room where we kept the pool chemicals and emergency equipment. Each time she passed, she'd glance at the keypad lock on the door, then quickly look away when she thought someone might be watching. I figured maybe she was just killing time or getting her steps in, but there was something deliberate about her movements, like she was memorizing the layout or timing something. That same evening, around 6 when most guests were heading to dinner, I saw her talking to one of the pool attendants, a guy named Rodrigo who'd been with the cruise line for years. They stood near the far corner of the deck, speaking in these hushed tones that didn't match the casual conversation you'd expect between crew and passengers. Rodrigo kept nodding and looking around nervously, and at one point, he pulled out his master key card and showed it to her briefly, before tucking it back into his pocket. When he noticed me watching from my lifeguard chair, he immediately ended the conversation and hurried away toward the crew stairs, while the woman simply adjusted her hat and strolled off like nothing had happened. The next morning, I arrived at the pool 30 minutes early to check the chlorine levels, part of my regular duties. The storage room door was slightly ajar, which was strange because it was supposed to lock automatically. Inside, everything looked normal at first. Chemicals on their shelves, rescue equipment hanging in place, the automatic pool cleaner coiled in the corner. But when I went to grab the testing kit from the back shelf, I noticed several small prescription bottles tucked behind a box of pH balancer. My first thought was that maybe another crew member had forgotten their medication. But when I picked one up, the label showed it was prescribed to a Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, one of our regular pool guests. The bottle was for Ambien and it was completely empty. Behind it were 4 more bottles, all different medications: Xanax, Valium, another Ambien, each prescribed to different elderly passengers I recognized from the pool, all empty. I stood there holding those bottles, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't medications someone would just accidentally leave in a storage room. The passengers whose names were on these labels were all frequent visitors to the quiet pool, all traveling alone or with equally elderly spouses. Mrs. Whitman specifically had mentioned to me just 2 days ago that she'd been feeling unusually drowsy lately, attributing it to seasickness even though the waters had been calm. The pieces started forming a picture I didn't want to see. Someone was collecting these medications, but for what purpose? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Were they selling them, using them to sedate passengers? I carefully photographed each bottle with my phone before placing them back exactly where I'd found them, then locked the storage room and tried to act normal for the rest of my shift. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything except those bottles. Every elderly passenger at the pool suddenly seemed vulnerable, potential victims of whatever scheme was happening. Around 3 o'clock, I noticed Mrs. Whitman arrive for her usual swim, moving slower than normal, her eyes glazed and unfocused. She stumbled slightly getting into the pool and I had to steady her. "Thank you, dear," she said, her words slightly slurred. "I don't know what's wrong with me lately." Yesterday I woke up and my pearl necklace was on the nightstand instead of in the safe where I always put it. Must be getting forgetful. That detail sent a chill through me. Someone wasn't just stealing medications, they were using them to incapacitate passengers and access their rooms. The woman in the hat appeared again around 4, this time with a man I'd never seen before, tall and thin with acne scars across his cheeks. They sat at a table pretending to read magazines, but their eyes tracked every elderly guest who entered or left the pool area. I decided to follow Mrs. Whitman when she left at 5:30, keeping a safe distance as she made her way to the elevator. She pressed the button for Deck 9, where the premium cabins were located, and I watched the numbers climb before taking the stairs down. By the time I reached her floor, she was already at her door, struggling with her key card. A housekeeping cart sat abandoned in the hallway about 3 doors down, which was odd since housekeeping usually finished this deck by early afternoon. I pretended to check my phone while watching Mrs. Whitman finally get her door open and disappear inside. Less than a minute later, a housekeeper emerged from a supply closet near the abandoned cart, except she wasn't wearing the standard uniform quite right. The name tag was pinned too high, the shoes were wrong, and when she turned, I recognized her immediately. It was the woman from the pool, without her hat and sunglasses, pushing the cart directly toward Mrs. Whitman's room. My instinct was to confront her right there, but I knew I needed more proof than just suspicion. Instead, I ducked into an alcove near the ice machine and called security from my phone, whispering that I'd seen someone suspicious impersonating housekeeping on Deck 9. While waiting for them to arrive, I watched the fake housekeeper knock on Mrs. Whitman's door. When the elderly woman answered, I could hear the imposter's voice, unnaturally sweet and clear. "Housekeeping, ma'am. Just need to check your bathroom ventilation. There's been a problem with the system." Mrs. Whitman, still in her drowsy state, let her in without question. My heart pounded as I counted the seconds, knowing that security's response time on a ship this size could be 5 to 10 minutes. After about 3 minutes, the woman emerged, pushing her cart quickly toward the service elevator. I managed to snap a photo of her face just as the security officer rounded the corner, but by then, she'd already disappeared into the elevator, and the officer seemed more annoyed than concerned when I tried to explain what I'd witnessed. The security officer, a burly man with a thick Boston accent named Frank, listened to my story with barely concealed skepticism. He knocked on Mrs. Whitman's door to check on her, and she answered, seemingly fine but confused about why security was there. "Everything's perfectly all right," she assured us, though I noticed her jewelry box was open on the dresser behind her, and she kept touching her bare neck where her pearls usually hung. Frank asked if anything was missing, but Mrs. Whitman just laughed in that foggy way and said she'd probably misplaced them somewhere. After Frank left, dismissing the whole thing as a misunderstanding, I went back to my cabin and started documenting everything. The photos of the medicine bottles, the woman's face, the timeline of events. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I decided to go back to the pool deck to check if anyone was accessing the storage room after hours. The deck was supposed to be closed, but as I approached, I could see a thin beam of light coming from under the storage room door. I crept closer, hearing muffled voices from inside, at least 3 different people. Through a crack in the door, I could see Rodrigo, the woman from earlier, and the scarred man, plus 2 others I didn't recognize. They were sorting through prescription bottles, transferring pills into unmarked containers. The scarred man was counting cash, and I heard him mention cabin numbers and tomorrow's targets. "The Brennans in 9047, they'll be at the captain's dinner," he said. "And that widow in 9012, she takes her evening swim at 7 like clockwork." My phone was recording everything through the crack when suddenly someone grabbed my shoulder from behind. It was another accomplice I hadn't seen, a woman with bleached blonde hair and cold gray eyes. Before I could react or scream, she pressed something against my neck, a syringe, and whispered, "Should have minded your own business, pool boy." The last thing I remember was the deck spinning and my phone clattering across the floor as everything went dark. I woke up in the ship's medical center 12 hours later with the worst headache of my life, and the chief security officer, the captain, and 2 FBI agents standing around my bed. Turns out, my phone had uploaded everything to the cloud before I passed out, And my roommate, a bartender named Kevin, had reported me missing when I didn't show up for my morning shift. Security finally took it seriously and found me unconscious on the pool deck. The syndicate, because that's what it was, an organized crime ring that had been operating on cruise ships for months, had cleared out by then, but they'd left enough evidence behind in their rush to escape. 7 crew members and 3 passengers were eventually arrested at the next port. They'd been targeting elderly passengers on multiple cruise lines, stealing hundreds of thousands in cash and valuables. Mrs. Whitman's pearls alone were worth $40,000. The woman who drugged me got 15 years, and I had to testify via video link 6 months later. The cruise line offered me a settlement to keep quiet about their security failures, which I took. It paid off my student loans and then some. I never went back to lifeguarding after that summer. These days, I work at a bank in Nevada, and I still can't look at a swimming pool without remembering that thin beam of light under the door. The semester had been brutal at Northwestern, and when my roommate Blake suggested we blow our tax returns on a 7-day cruise for spring break, I jumped at the chance. It was March 2016, and the 6 of us, Blake, Megan, Josh, Samantha, Carlos, and myself, had pooled our money for adjoining cabins on the Atlantic Jewel, this massive ship that looked more like a floating city than anything that should reasonably exist on water. I was 21, studying journalism, always the one taking notes about everything, documenting our adventures with this old film camera my grandfather had given me. We'd been at sea for 2 days already, somewhere between Charleston and Bermuda, when everything started to unravel. The ship had 4,000 passengers, 14 decks, and more restaurants than our entire college town. But it was what happened on Deck 9, in the narrow hallway between the spa and the library, that turned our vacation into something I still can't fully comprehend, something that makes me question whether cruise lines are hiding more than just their casino odds. I first noticed Amber. That wasn't her real name, but that's what the crew called her because of this striking amber pendant she always wore during the mandatory safety drill on day 1. She stood out because she was alone, maybe early 30s, with these thick reading glasses and a stack of books that she clutched like precious cargo, while everyone else was taking selfies in their life vests. She had this habit of writing constantly in a leather journal, sitting in the same corner booth of the breakfast buffet every morning at exactly 6:45 before the crowds arrived. I knew this because I'm an early riser, always have been since high school when I worked at my dad's bakery, and I'd grab coffee while watching the sunrise from the observation deck. Amber would nod at me each morning, this small acknowledgement between 2 people who understood that the best part of any day happens before most people open their eyes. She had cabin 9047 just 3 doors down from ours, and I'd sometimes hear her door click shut late at night when I was coming back from the 24-hour pizza place on Deck 11. On Wednesday morning, our 3rd day at sea, Amber wasn't at her usual booth. The amber pendant sat on her table next to an untouched cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her journal open to a page covered in what looked like ship deck blueprints she'd sketched herself. I remembered thinking she must have gone to the bathroom, maybe felt seasick. The waves had been rough the night before, these 12-foot swells that made the chandelier in the main atrium swing like a hypnotist's watch. But when I came back an hour later with Blake and Megan for a proper breakfast, everything was still there, untouched. The busboy, this kid named Tommy from the Philippines who always remembered everyone's coffee order, was standing near the table looking confused. He told us she never left her stuff like that she treated that journal like it contained state secrets, always tucked it under her arm even when she went to refill her orange juice. By lunch, her things had been cleared away, and when we asked the restaurant manager about it, he just shrugged and said she probably went on one of the shore excursions, even though we weren't scheduled to dock until the next morning. That afternoon, Carlos and I decided to check on her. We figured maybe she was sick, needed someone to bring her some of those seasickness bags from the medical center. When we got to cabin 9047, the door was slightly open, this narrow gap that showed only darkness inside. The housekeeping cart was parked outside, but no staff anywhere, which was weird because they always worked in pairs on this ship, some kind of safety protocol they'd mentioned during orientation. I knocked, called out asking if everything was okay, and when no one answered, I pushed the door open wider. The cabin was pristine, bed made with those fancy towel animals the crew created every day. Hers was a swan with sunglasses, but all of Amber's belongings were still there. Her clothes hung in the closet, organized by color like some kind of rainbow gradient. Her medication bottles lined up on the bathroom counter. Even her passport sat on the nightstand next to a half-eaten chocolate from the evening turn-down service. But the strangest thing was her laptop, still open and powered on, displaying what looked like hundreds of photos of empty corridors and stairwells throughout the ship, all time-stamped from the past 2 days, all showing these specific spots where the ceiling had these dark domes. Security cameras. Carlos grabbed my arm and pointed at the screen. There was a folder labeled Blind Spots with a file inside that mapped out every area on the ship where cameras couldn't see. Deck 9 had the most gaps, especially near the maintenance doors and this weird section behind the spa, where the crew had built a temporary wall for renovations. Before we could look closer, we heard footsteps in the hallway, that distinct sound of hard-soled shoes that security officers wore. We quickly left the cabin, trying to look casual, but the head of security, Mr. Garrison, was already there with 2 other officers. He had this way of smiling that never reached his eyes, just his mouth moving while the rest of his face stayed frozen like those old portraits in the ship's history display. He asked what we were doing, and when we explained about Amber being missing, he pulled out a tablet and showed us a log entry. A. Fitzgerald disembarked at Port Charlestown, 11:47 a.m. I told him that was impossible since we were still at sea, hadn't docked anywhere, and Port Charlestown wasn't even on our itinerary. His smile got wider, and he said I must be confused about the schedule, that sometimes the salt air makes passengers lose track of time, then suggested we enjoy the pool deck since it was such a beautiful day. That evening, our whole group gathered in Josh and Carlos's cabin to discuss what we'd seen. Samantha, who was studying computer science, had managed to take photos of Amber's laptop screen with her phone before we left, and when she zoomed in, we could see something disturbing. The metadata on Amber's photos showed they were taken with a camera that had been reported stolen from another passenger 2 weeks earlier, on a completely different cruise. Blake pulled up the ship's public Facebook page on his phone, scrolling through thousands of photos from previous voyages, and there she was, Amber, or someone who looked exactly like her, in the background of at least 12 different cruises over the past year, always alone, always carrying that same leather journal. But in each photo, she had a different name on her cruise badge: Rebecca, Diana, Melissa, always working her way through the ship, always taking pictures. Megan suggested we report this to someone, maybe the FBI when we docked, but Josh pointed out something that made us all go quiet. In 3 of those photos, there were news articles in the comments about passengers who had gone missing on those exact cruises, always solo travelers, always supposedly disembarked at ports the ships never actually visited. The next morning I woke up at 5:30 to find Blake's bed empty, his sheets twisted into a tight spiral like he'd been grabbed while sleeping. His phone was still on the nightstand playing the same song on repeat, this old jazz tune his mom loved that he used as an alarm. But the volume was turned down so low you could barely hear it. His camera bag was gone, though, the expensive one his parents had bought him for his photography minor, and there were wet footprints leading from his bed to our balcony door, which was locked from the inside with the safety latch still engaged. I ran to Josh and Carlos's cabin, pounding on their door until they stumbled out half asleep, and we searched everywhere Blake might go for sunrise photos. The observation deck, the jogging track, even that secret spot near the crew quarters where you could see dolphins if you got up early enough. Nothing. When we went to security, Mr. Garrison was already there, waiting for us with that same frozen smile, holding Blake's camera bag. He said Blake had been found trying to access restricted areas near the engine room and had been placed in what he called temporary detention for the safety of other passengers, that we could see him when we docked. But when I looked at the camera bag, The serial number was different from Blake's. I knew because I'd helped him register it for insurance just 2 months ago. We spent the rest of that morning mapping out every blind spot Amber had documented, using Samantha's programming skills to overlay the ship's official deck plans with the photos from Amber's laptop. There were 17 areas where someone could disappear without being seen by cameras, and most of them connected to service corridors that ran parallel to the passenger areas, like a hidden circulatory system inside the ship's walls. Megan had started recording everything on her phone, creating what she called evidence files, when she discovered something in the background of one video, a reflection in a window that showed 2 crew members carrying what looked like a body bag through one of those blind spots, but the timestamp showed it was from 3 hours in the future. We realized her phone's clock had somehow been changed, or the ship's internal time system was being manipulated. Carlos wanted to confront the captain directly, but Josh stopped him, showing us something he'd found in the ship's terms and conditions that we'd all agreed to when we booked. A clause stating that in international waters, the cruise line had full authority over passenger detention and could relocate passengers to alternative accommodations for safety violations without prior notice or consent. That afternoon, we decided to test something. Samantha had noticed that all the missing passengers, including Amber, had one thing in common. They'd all ordered room service between 2 and 4 a.m. on the night before they vanished. The menu items were always the same: chamomile tea, wheat crackers, and something called Chef's Special Supplement, which wasn't listed on any menu we could find. I volunteered to place the exact same order that night, but the others refused to let me do it alone. Instead, we set up a buddy system. I'd place the order while Samantha hid in the bathroom with her phone recording. Megan would be on our balcony watching through the glass door, and Josh and Carlos would wait in the hallway, pretending to be drunk and lost. At 2:17 a.m., I called room service and asked for the specific items. The woman on the phone paused for so long I thought the line had disconnected, then asked for my cabin number twice, like she was verifying something on a list. 20 minutes later, there was a knock. Not the usual cheerful room service announcement, but just 3 slow, deliberate knocks. When I opened the door, it wasn't the usual room service uniform, but 2 men in maintenance coveralls, one holding a tray with a silver dome cover that seemed too large for tea and crackers. The bigger one kept trying to look past me into the room, while the other insisted I needed to sign a special dietary waiver for the supplement, his hand strategically covering most of the text on the form. I pretended to read the waiver while Samantha texted frantically from the bathroom. She could see through the door crack that there was a 3rd person in the hallway, just out of my view, holding what looked like zip tie restraints. I suddenly claimed I'd changed my mind, that my stomach felt queasy from the waves, and tried to close the door, but the bigger man wedged his foot against it. He said I'd already been charged for the order, that it would be wasteful not to take it, his voice flat and mechanical like he was reading from a script. That's when Carlos and Josh stumbled around the corner, playing their drunk act perfectly, singing some ridiculous college fight song and asking the maintenance guys for directions to the casino. The moment of distraction was enough. I slammed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt, hearing muffled arguing in the hallway. Through the peephole, I watched the 3rd person step into view, and I recognized him immediately. It was Tommy, the busboy from the breakfast restaurant, but his friendly demeanor was completely gone, replaced by something cold and calculating as he spoke rapidly into a radio in a language I didn't recognize. They stayed outside our door for another 10 minutes, occasionally testing the handle, before finally leaving. The next morning came with an announcement that made everyone's blood chill. The captain's voice, usually warm and jovial, was replaced by Mr. Garrison speaking in that same flat tone the maintenance men had used. He announced that due to a medical situation, the ship would be making an unscheduled stop at a private facility island for passenger wellness evaluations, and that all guests should remain in their cabins until called by deck number. Through our balcony, we could see this island that hadn't been there the night before, or maybe it had been, but covered in morning fog, with a concrete dock and white buildings that looked more like warehouses than any medical facility. Samantha checked her GPS, but it showed we were somehow still in the exact coordinates from yesterday, like the island didn't exist on any map. That's when Megan noticed something horrifying on her phone. All the videos she'd recorded were slowly corrupting, the files deteriorating in real time, pixels dissolving like acid eating through digital evidence. She quickly uploaded what she could to 3 different cloud services using the ship's Wi-Fi. But the upload bars weren't moving, stuck at 0% like the data was being intercepted. We had to make a decision, stay in our cabins and wait to be evaluated, or try to find Blake and get to the lifeboats we'd located in one of Amber's blind spots, the ones that weren't on any official safety diagram. We chose to run. Using Amber's map, we navigated through the service corridors, these narrow metal passages that smelled like rust and industrial cleaner, where the elegant cruise ship facade disappeared completely. We found Blake on deck 3, in a medical bay that wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't on any deck plan, strapped to a gurney with an IV drip of something clear that made his pupils look like pinpoints. He was conscious but couldn't speak, just kept blinking in this pattern that Josh recognized as Morse code from his Eagle Scout days. DONTTRUSTWATER. We unstrapped him, and Carlos practically carried him as we made our way to the hidden lifeboats. But when we got there, we found we weren't alone. 17 other passengers were already there, all clutching their belongings, all solo travelers who'd figured out the truth. One of them, an older woman named Gladys who'd been a naval engineer, had already prepped the boat for launch. She said she'd been watching these ships for years, tracking disappearances, that this wasn't about robbery or ransom but something else, something about testing how people react to certain stimuli in isolation, that the supplement was just the latest experiment. As we lowered the lifeboat, alarms started blaring and we could see crew members running toward us, but it was too late. We hit the water hard, the motor started on the first try, and we sped away from that floating laboratory disguised as paradise. The Coast Guard found us 8 hours later, 23 people crammed into a lifeboat meant for 15, about 40 miles off the coast of Virginia. Blake had started recovering once we got away from the ship, though he couldn't remember anything after going to bed that night. Just vague sensations of being moved through corridors and voices speaking in languages that sounded familiar but wrong, like English played backwards. When we told the Coast Guard officers about the Atlantic Jewel and showed them what little evidence we had left, some corrupted videos, Samantha's screenshots, our testimonies, they exchanged these looks that told us this wasn't the first time they'd heard this story. The officer in charge, Commander Briggs, took our statements separately, asking specific questions about the blind spots, the room service patterns, the mysterious island. He told us off the record that there had been similar reports from 6 different cruise lines over the past 3 years, always the same pattern, but by the time authorities investigated, the ship's logs showed nothing unusual. Passengers listed as disembarked had their credit cards used at ports days later, and any physical evidence had mysteriously vanished. The Atlantic Jewel, according to their records, had reported us as medical evacuations due to a severe norovirus outbreak, complete with fabricated medical records and witness statements from passengers we'd never met. We never found out what happened to Amber, if that was even her real name, or if she was another investigator who got too close to the truth. The cruise line offered us full refunds and free cruises for life if we signed NDAs, which our lawyers told us were so ironclad that even mentioning the company's name publicly could result in lawsuits that would destroy us financially. We didn't sign. Instead, we started a website documenting cruise disappearances, using pseudonyms and being careful never to name specific companies, but providing enough details that other potential victims could recognize the patterns. Blake never fully recovered his memory of that night, but sometimes he'll smell something, always industrial cleaner mixed with salt air, and have panic attacks. Samantha managed to recover one video from a cached file on her phone, just 12 seconds of footage showing that reflection in the window, and she spent the past 8 years trying to enhance it, convinced there's something in those pixels that will explain everything. The Atlantic Jewel still operates, though under a different name now, and every few months we get emails from people who've read our site, saying they recognize the signs and got off at the next port. That's the only victory we have, knowing that maybe we've helped some people avoid whatever was supposed to happen in those blind spots, in those hidden medical bays, on islands that don't exist on any map. I had just turned 61 a few months before the trip, and that cruise was supposed to be my small celebration, a reward to myself after 4 decades in the healthcare system. I'd worked as a nurse in everything from pediatric wards to hospice units, and finally retired from a private clinic in Sacramento. The cruise was a 12-day South American route, starting in Valparaiso, and scheduled to loop around a few coastal cities before ending in Buenos Aires. I was traveling alone, something I actually enjoyed. I liked the quiet, the anonymity, the chance to read in peace without anyone needing a thermometer or a morphine adjustment. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for: warm breezes, lazy mornings on the observation deck, and a book in one hand with a cocktail in the other. Things started shifting on the 5th day. I remember because I'd just finished breakfast and gone down to Deck 4 to browse the small onboard library. As I walked past the elevators, I noticed a man, mid-40s, thin, sunburnt, doubled over on one of the benches, coughing into his shirt sleeve. I almost kept walking, but something about the sound made me pause. It wasn't your standard dry cough. It had weight to it, like there was liquid in his lungs. A few feet away, a woman, maybe his partner, sat with her arms crossed, nervously glancing around, as if hoping no one else would notice them. I gave it a second look, shrugged it off, and kept going. I wish I hadn't. By lunchtime, I started seeing it everywhere. People sneezing, coughing harshly, leaning against walls looking dizzy. In the buffet line, one elderly man had to sit down suddenly with a napkin pressed to his mouth. Another guest quietly helped him back to his room. But no announcements were made, no notes slipped under cabin doors, no intercom messages. Nothing. I figured maybe it was norovirus. Those can sweep through cruise ships like wildfire. But this didn't feel like stomach bugs. It was all respiratory, and more passengers were visibly unwell. I asked one of the staff near the coffee station if medical was aware. She gave me a weird smile, nodded, and told me everything was under control. That was the first time I felt something was being hidden. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I stepped out onto my balcony just to breathe in the ocean air. That's when I saw 2 crew members, both wearing surgical masks and gloves, pushing a cart covered in black plastic down the corridor across from mine. One of them looked over his shoulder more than once, like he was making sure no one was watching. I ducked back into my room and shut off the light. I've seen that kind of behavior in hospital lockdown drills. It wasn't about precaution. It was containment. That next morning, whole sections of Deck 5 were blocked off with velvet ropes and signs saying maintenance. But I'd walked those halls the day before. There was nothing under maintenance. I decided to speak with someone at the front desk, not to make a scene, just to ask directly if there was an outbreak on board. The woman behind the counter had that cruise line polish to her. Smile practiced, voice smooth. When I asked if there had been a spike in illness, she didn't flinch. She told me the captain was aware, and that the crew was taking proactive steps to ensure the health and safety of all guests. No mention of what the illness was, no mention of quarantine procedures, and absolutely no effort to even pretend it wasn't happening. I asked if the doctor was available. She said he was very busy at the moment, but rest assured, he's been briefed. That phrase, been briefed, didn't sit right with me. I wasn't looking for military jargon. I wanted a medical answer. I spent the afternoon trying not to obsess. I watched some movies in the little theater, read on the pool deck, even attended a trivia game. But the coughing kept following me. Every room I entered, someone had that same deep, hacking sound, like they were coughing from the bottom of their ribs. By dinner, the staff started wearing masks too. That's when I knew they weren't expecting this to blow over. I asked my waiter, a young guy named Mateo who had served me twice already, if he knew what was going on. His eyes darted toward the hallway before he whispered, "They told us not to say anything, but the doctor's been seeing over 40 people a day." That confirmed it. Whatever was spreading was real, and it was bad. The next morning, I noticed we were still at sea, way past the point we were supposed to dock in Montevideo. No announcement, no explanation, just floating. I asked a woman at breakfast if she'd heard anything. She hadn't. Later that afternoon, I went up to the fitness center to walk a bit, and the windows gave a good view of the ocean. No land in sight. I started talking to other passengers, quietly comparing what we'd seen and heard. Turns out I wasn't alone. A man from Oregon told me he saw a crew member sealing off an entire hallway on deck 6 with plastic tarps. Another woman said she was told not to leave her cabin for the day as a precaution. The pieces weren't adding up. We were being kept out here on purpose, and nobody was admitting it. That night, the hallways got quieter. Not just calmer, eerily silent. The usual shuffle of sandals, the low murmur of conversation, all of it gone. Around midnight, I heard the soft hiss of a walkie-talkie just outside my cabin door. I peeked through the peephole. 2 security staff stood there, both masked, one holding a clipboard and the other with some kind of electronic reader. They scanned something on the door across from mine, tapped a few buttons, and moved on. The next morning, the door they'd scanned had a white sticker on it with a bold red line through it. I walked by slowly, trying not to look suspicious, and noticed the room number had been blacked out. There was no nameplate, no "Do Not Disturb" sign, nothing. Just that sticker, like someone had erased the cabin from the system. On day 9, they finally made an announcement. Not over the intercom, but as a printed letter slid under our doors. It said we'd be extending our voyage due to a logistical delay with port access, and that all amenities would remain available. No mention of illness, no mention of sick passengers, just a thin excuse wrapped in hospitality fluff. I watched people read the letter in the hallway, some confused, others clearly panicked. An older couple across from me started packing their bags anyway, even though we had nowhere to go. It was clear the staff were following a script, a very specific one. And it wasn't for our benefit, it was to contain panic. By then, I'd started keeping to myself. I only left my room for food, and I avoided the lower decks entirely. One night I made the mistake of taking the stairs after the elevator stalled. I passed one of the sealed corridors, this time with 2 armed guards standing in front of it. Armed, on a luxury cruise ship. They didn't say a word, but they watched me closely as I passed. That moment cemented what I already suspected. This wasn't just a bad flu or an overreaction. They were isolating people, possibly detaining them, and the rest of us were being kept distracted just enough to stay cooperative. We weren't passengers anymore. We were inventory. On day 11, we finally docked in a small port, not the original one listed on the itinerary. We weren't allowed to disembark until local officials boarded the ship. I saw them come on wearing hazmat suits, not masks, full suits. They inspected several cabins, including one of the sealed ones, and then spoke with the captain privately. Hours later, we were let off the ship one group at a time, with no explanation. Just a screening tent and instructions to head directly to the terminal. No stopping. I asked one of the men in uniform what the illness was. He didn't even look at me, just pointed to the exit. I still don't know what exactly happened on that cruise. I heard rumors, pneumonia clusters, some kind of respiratory virus that hadn't been disclosed yet. A few forums mentioned something about a containment protocol called Code Orange, but nothing official ever came out. No reports, no media stories, just silence. I think about that trip more than I want to admit. How quickly things changed, how fast we went from guests to something else entirely. I came home healthy somehow, but I've never taken another cruise. I don't think I ever will.